Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we wander slowly through the frozen darkness of colonial America in the winter of 1704, where the wind slips through unfinished walls. Candles cost precious money, and every long night feels just a little uncertain. Snow drifts across muddy village paths while chimney smoke hangs low in the icy air like tired grey ghosts. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then goes quiet again. You stand in the middle of a settlement small enough that everyone knows each other's business, yet large enough that people still disappear into the woods sometimes and are simply never seen again, which is honestly not very comforting when the sun sets before supper and you're carrying nothing but a lantern that barely survives a strong sneeze. And just to improve your confidence, you probably would not survive this. Not because you lack courage, mostly because modern humans become emotionally unstable when Wi-Fi disappears for 6 minutes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to post your location and local time down in the comments. It is always strangely comforting knowing who else is awake somewhere out there in the dark. Now, dim the lights. You trudge carefully along the frozen lane between rough wooden cabins, while snow creaks beneath your boots with that dry, brittle sound winter only makes in deep cold. The settlement rests beside a half-frozen river somewhere along the eastern colonies, still young by European standards and painfully fragile by any sensible standard at all. The first thing you notice is the smell. Smoke, wet wool, animal manure buried beneath snow, salted fish, wood sap, and somewhere faintly underneath everything else, the sharp scent of freezing water drifting from the riverbank. Colonial towns rarely smelled pleasant in winter. A commonly accepted historical reality is that sanitation remained extremely primitive in the early 18th century. Especially during colder months when waste disposal became difficult and muddy streets froze into uneven ridges of ice and filth. Charming little detail for your evening relaxation. Ahead of you, warm light flickers faintly behind oiled paper windows. Glass exists here, certainly, but it remains expensive enough that many ordinary homes still rely on cheaper materials all stretched across wooden frames. The light itself feels weak compared to modern bulbs. Colonial darkness carried weight. Once the sun disappeared, most people simply accepted that large parts of life would become slower, dimmer, and more uncertain. You pass a stable where a horse shifts heavily in its stall. Steam rises from its body into the freezing air. The animal smells warm and alive, which somehow feels reassuring tonight. Nearby, chickens huddle together in miserable silence. Even the livestock seem emotionally exhausted by winter. Farther down the road, you hear muffled voices from inside a cabin. A baby crying, someone coughing, a chair scraping against wooden floors, then laughter. Brief, tired laughter. That may be the strangest thing about colonial winter nights. People still found ways to laugh. You pull your coat tighter as wind slips between the buildings. It reaches through layers of wool with icy fingers that somehow locate every vulnerable inch of skin. Your nose burns slightly each time you inhale. Historians still argue whether winters during parts of the early 18th century felt harsher because of the colder climate associated with the Little Ice Age, or whether surviving records simply emphasize extreme weather more dramatically than usual. Either way, standing here tonight, you're not especially interested in academic nuance. You are interested in not freezing to death beside a cabbage barrel. A lantern swings outside the nearest tavern. You approach slowly. The building leans slightly sideways as though exhausted from resisting storms year after year. Snow piles against the walls almost halfway to the windows. Someone has hung pine branches above the entrance for decoration, though they now resemble tired green brooms abandoned by optimistic holiday spirits. Inside, warmth finally reaches you. Well, relative warmth. Colonial taverns were often social centres during winter evenings. Men gather to exchange news, conduct business, debate politics, complain about taxes, and consume enough ale to temporarily forget the surrounding wilderness wanted them dead. You step through the doorway and immediately hear the low thunder of conversation mixed with crackling firewood. The room glows gold beneath candlelight. Shadows move constantly across the beams overhead. A woman carries bowls of stew between crowded tables, while two sailors argue quietly near the hearth. Their coats still sparkle faintly with melted snow. One man smells strongly of pipe smoke and wet leather. Another has a boot so caked with frozen mud they appear sculpted rather than worn. You settle near the fire. The heat reaches your face first while your back remains cold. Colonial heating worked unevenly at best. One side of your body could feel nearly comfortable while the other still belonged entirely to winter. Someone nearby mentions wolves. Another man dismisses the story immediately. Then a third claims he heard screams near the forest edge 3 nights earlier. That happens often in colonial settlements. Information spreads quickly, but certainty almost never arrives with it. Rumours move faster than horses. An unusual historical tidbit from the period involves people sometimes sleeping in nightcaps specifically designed to reduce heat loss during winter evenings, which sounds faintly adorable until you remember frost occasionally formed inside bedrooms overnight. Suddenly the little sleeping hats begin feeling less decorative and more survival-oriented. The tavern keeper places a wooden mug in front of you. Warm cider. You wrap stiff fingers around it gratefully. Outside. Darkness thickens against the windows. There are no electric lamps beyond the tavern walls, no distant highways glowing softly across the hills. Once candles dimmed and hearth fires weakened, colonial nights became profoundly dark in ways modern people rarely experience anymore. You stare into the flames a while. The wood snaps softly. Someone yawns. Snow taps lightly against the roof. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin adjusting to the rhythm of this place. The long pauses in conversation, the careful use of candlelight, the constant awareness of weather. Every person here understands winter not as a season, but as an opponent. Eventually you rise again and step back outside. The cold greets you immediately, sharp enough to steal your breath for half a second. Above the settlement, the sky stretches clear and enormous. Stars burn fiercely over the frozen colony, while chimney smoke drifts upward through silver moonlight. Somewhere in the woods beyond the cabins, branches creak softly beneath snow. You continue down the narrow lane between houses where families now settle close beside their hearths for the night. And ahead of you, through one glowing window, you catch sight of supper being served beside the fire. You pause outside the glowing cabin window while snow drifts softly around your boots. Inside, fire-lit flickers across rough timber walls stained dark with years of smoke. The family gathered there moves slowly, carefully, conserving energy the same way they conserve candles, food, and warmth. Winter teaches economy in strange ways. Nothing is wasted here if it can possibly survive another day. You step toward the door and duck slightly beneath the low wooden frame as someone inside pulls it open. Warmth touches your face first, carrying the heavy, comforting scent of stew, thickened with barley and root vegetables. Behind that comes the sharper smell of smoke soaked into clothing, blankets, even hair. Colonial homes absorbed smoke the way modern homes absorb internet signals. It simply existed everywhere. All the time. The cabin itself is smaller than you expected. That surprises many modern people. Colonial families often lived in remarkably cramped conditions during the early 18th century, especially in frontier or working settlements. One widely recognized historical fact is that entire households frequently shared single-room homes where cooking, eating, sleeping, and working all occurred within the same crowded space. You glance upward. Wooden beams cross the ceiling overhead, blackened by soot. Bundles of drying herbs hang near the hearth beside strips of salted meat. A kettle swings gently above the fire while fat bubbles slowly inside an iron pot. The mother stirs the stew with steady, tired movements. Two children sit cross-legged near the fire, wrapped in wool blankets that look scratchy enough to qualify as medieval punishment devices. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, watches the pot with complete concentration. Beside him, a younger girl leans sleepily against a dog large enough to resemble a small bear. The father nods politely as you enter. His hands are cracked from cold weather and hard labour. Tiny white scars cross his knuckles. You notice immediately how exhausted everyone looks. Not dramatic exhaustion, just the heavy, ordinary tiredness of people who work from dawn until darkness every single day. The fire snaps softly. Wind presses faintly against the cabin walls. And somewhere outside, snow slides from the roof with a muffled thump. You settle onto a rough stool near the hearth. The heat feels glorious after the frozen street outside. Though your boots still remain damp and cold, colonial homes rarely stayed evenly warm during winter. Heat gathered closest to the fire while colder air lingered near doors, corners and windows. Families naturally clustered together beside hearths like determined penguins wearing wool socks. Bowls are passed carefully around the room. The stew itself looks simple. Turnips, onions, bits of salt pork, perhaps carrots if the harvest proved generous months earlier. Yet tonight the meal smells wonderful because winter sharpens gratitude. Hunger transforms ordinary soup into emotional therapy. You take a spoonful carefully. It tastes smoky, salty, and slightly earthy from the root vegetables stored underground since autumn. Colonists depended heavily on preserved foods during winter months because fresh produce became scarce once cold weather settled in. Cellars filled with cabbages, onions, dried beans, and salted meats often determined whether families survived comfortably or spent the season hungry. The younger child drops a piece of bread. The dog catches it instantly with the reflexes of a creature that clearly understands frontier economics. Nobody even reacts. This has happened before, probably hourly. The father finally speaks while warming his hands beside the fire. He mentioned ice forming thicker along the river this year. Another man in town supposedly crossed part of it already despite everyone warning him not to. Colonial settlements overflowed with confident men making questionable winter decisions. Human history remains surprisingly consistent that way. The mother sighs softly. Apparently the same man also attempted homemade tooth extraction using rum and blacksmith tools last spring. Honestly, the colonies feel one bad afternoon away from chaos at all times. A lesser-known detail from early colonial life involves people sometimes placing heated bricks beneath blankets before sleep to warm their beds, which sounds cozy until you realize those bricks occasionally cracked or cooled too quickly, leaving someone clutching a disappointing rectangle of useless rock at midnight while frost gathered on the walls. The children begin eating faster now. You notice how carefully they scrape their spoons across the wooden bowls. Food carries different emotional weight during winter. Every mouthful represents work already completed and survival still uncertain. Outside, wind rises briefly. The cabin creaks. For a moment, everyone pauses instinctively. Colonial buildings made noises modern houses rarely make. Timber expanded and shifted constantly under changing temperatures. Roofs groaned beneath snow. Drafts whistled through unseen gaps. At night, isolated settlements often sounded alive in slightly unsettling ways. The younger girl glances nervously towards the dark window. Her mother notices immediately. Without speaking, she reaches over and squeezes the child's shoulder gently before returning to the stew pot. That quiet reassurance feels deeply practiced. You suspect winter nights create many small fears in children raised this close to wilderness. Wolves howl sometimes beyond the tree line. Travellers arrive with strange stories. Storms isolate settlements for days. Candlelight leaves corners dim enough for imagination to flourish enthusiastically. Scholars continue debating how much supernatural belief genuinely shaped daily colonial behaviour versus how often such stories simply entertained people during long evenings indoors. Still, listening to the wind outside tonight, it becomes easier to understand why eerie tales survived so easily in isolated communities. The father reaches toward a shelf and removes a small tin cup. Inside rests precious sugar. Very little of it. Sugar remained expensive for many ordinary colonial families, especially in remote settlements. He sprinkles the tiniest amount into the children's side almost ceremonially. Their faces brighten immediately as though witnessing actual magic. And perhaps they are. Tiny comforts matter enormously during difficult winters. The fire burns lower now. More wood is added carefully. You notice how everyone watches the flames afterward. Silently calculating. Firewood meant warmth, cooked food, light, survival. A poorly managed woodpile could turn winter deadly frighteningly fast. You glance around the room again. Wet gloves drying near the hearth. Snow melting from boots beside the door. Needles and thread resting near folded clothing waiting for repairs. A musket hanging from wooden pegs. Nothing decorative unless it also serves practical purpose. Even comfort here must justify itself. The mother finally sits down with her own bowl after everyone else has eaten. That detail quietly reflects another accepted reality of colonial domestic life. Women frequently worked later and rested less, especially during winter when cooking, mending, cleaning, and childcare all became harder inside crowded homes. The room grows quieter as supper ends. Spoons scrape softly against bowls. The dog sighs beside the children. Outside the window, snow continues falling through darkness thick enough to swallow the entire settlement beyond the cabin walls. And slowly, beneath flickering firelight, the long colonial evening begins settling fully around you. The bowls are emptied slowly beside the fire while darkness presses heavier against the cabin windows. Supper ends without ceremony. No dessert appears afterward unless you count the faint memory of sugar in the children's cider, which honestly seems to qualify as luxury tonight. The mother gathers the bowls carefully. Water for washing remains limited during winter, so nothing is cleaned carelessly. A kettle warms beside the fire while the father feeds another split log into the hearth. Sparks whirl briefly upward through the smoke before vanishing into the chimney. The cabin settles into evening rhythms now. Not silence exactly. Colonial homes rarely achieve true silence. The fire crackles constantly. Wind brushes against the roof. Someone coughs near the door. Wood creaks softly beneath shifting temperatures. Even breathing feels louder at night in small crowded spaces. You lean back slightly on the stool and watch candlelight flicker across the walls. The flame itself looks weaker than modern people imagine. Colonial candles often produce dim, uneven light, especially cheaper tallow candles made from animal fat. One well-established historical reality is that many ordinary families use candles sparingly because producing or purchasing them required significant labour and expense. The room smells different now that supper has ended. Less stew, more smoke, warm wool, melted tallow, and faintly beneath everything else, damp leather drying beside the hearth. The father removes a small wooden pipe from his coat pocket. Tobacco smoke soon joins the heavy air drifting beneath the ceiling beams. Nearby, the younger girl fights sleep with heroic determination while pretending to listen closely to adult conversation. Children across history have mastered this technique. The adults begin mending clothes. That may sound terribly dull to modern ears, but winter evenings often became essential working hours inside colonial homes. Shirts required patching, socks demanded repairs, torn gloves needed stitching before fingers froze outdoors tomorrow. Life here involved endless maintenance. Everything wore out quickly, and replacing goods remained expensive or impossible. The mother threads a needle carefully beside the candle. Her fingers move automatically. You suspect she could probably sew during a hurricane while half asleep and still outperform most modern humans attempting basic button repair after watching 3 online tutorials. The older boy sharpens a knife near the fire using slow practice movements. Metal scrapes softly against stone in steady rhythm. Every task tonight feels calm but purposeful. Nobody wastes motion. Outside, snow continues falling. You notice it gathering along the lower corners of the window covering. Frost creeps slowly across the edges in delicate white patterns resembling tiny frozen trees. The sight feels beautiful from inside the cabin. Considerably less beautiful if you are currently trapped outdoors beside a horse named Margaret, who has decided winter represents a personal insult. The father begins telling a story now. Not dramatically, just quietly, as people often do late at night. He describes a traveller who arrived last winter nearly frozen after losing the road during a storm. Apparently the man wandered so long through drifting snow he began speaking to fence posts as though they were church members. Nobody laughs immediately. That detail feels important. People here understand how easily cold destroys judgment. A lesser-known colonial tidbit involves some settlers believing certain storms carried spiritual meaning or the divine warnings. Severe weather often blended naturally with religious interpretation because survival felt deeply uncertain. When entire crops failed or blizzards buried settlements for days, people searched desperately for explanations larger than simple bad luck. The younger girl finally asks whether the traveller survived. The father pauses before nodding once. Barely. You notice how the room relaxes afterward. Stories during winter evenings served many purposes. Entertainment certainly, but also warnings, lessons, shared reassurance that danger existed yet could sometimes be overcome. Scholars still disagree about how much literacy shaped ordinary colonial evenings because reading materials remained scarce and expensive for many families. Yet oral storytelling flourished almost everywhere. Long dark nights practically invited conversation. Without modern entertainment, people became remarkably skilled at talking, listening, remembering details, and occasionally terrifying children with ghost stories directly before bedtime. Speaking of which, the older boy now asks whether anyone has heard the sounds near the river lately. The room grows slightly quieter. Even the dog lifts its head, and apparently several people in town claim strange cries echo across the ice after midnight. One man insists they belong to foxes, another swears they sound almost human. The mother immediately dismisses the topic. Too quickly, perhaps. You notice the children exchange interested looks anyway. And honestly, isolated settlements plus endless darkness plus exhausted people equals ideal conditions for very questionable nighttime conclusions. The candle flame wavers suddenly as cold air slips through unseen cracks in the walls. You feel the draft brush across your ankles beneath the stool. Colonial homes constantly battled infiltration from winter weather. Even well-built cabins struggled against freezing temperatures, especially during storms. The mother pulls another blanket around the younger child. Wool scratches softly against wool. The fire pops loudly. Outside somewhere, a branch snaps in the woods. Everyone pauses again, just briefly. Stillness follows. Then conversation resumes. You begin noticing how naturally colonial families listen to the world outside their walls. Modern people often ignore environmental sounds completely because cities surround them with constant noise. But here, every unfamiliar sound matters. Wind direction matters. Animal noises matter. Silence itself sometimes matters most of all. The father eventually removes a battered book from a shelf near the hearth. A Bible. Books remained precious possessions in many colonial households. He reads aloud slowly while the family listens beneath dim candlelight. His voice rises and falls gently over the crackling fire. The younger child finally curls beside the dog and closes her eyes halfway through the passage. The room grows sleepier now, more peaceful, yet still slightly tense in that peculiar frontier way where comfort never fully erases awareness of danger. You study the cabin carefully once more. Drying herbs hanging from rafters, snow melting into puddles near the boots, soft orange firelight reflecting in tired eye. Smoke trapped beneath the ceiling beams, Every detail feels temporary somehow, as though winter constantly tests whether this fragile little household deserves remaining here at all. Another accepted fact of colonial life is that many settlements truly existed on the edge of survival during difficult winters. Food shortages, illness, storms, and isolation threatened communities regularly. People endured not because life became easy, but because they adapted gradually to hardship most modern visitors would find astonishing. The father closes the book gently. The candle burns lower. And outside beyond the trembling window, the frozen colonial night stretches endlessly through the dark woods surrounding the settlement. The fire burns lower as the evening stretches deeper into night. Candlelight trembles gently across the cabin walls, revealing every uneven plank and every narrow seam where cold air slips patiently indoors. You begin noticing the drafts now, almost constantly. One brushes against your neck, another curls around your boots, a third somehow reaches directly through 2 blankets and several layers of dignity. Colonial winter comfort remains an ambitious concept at best. The father rises from his stool and presses a strip of cloth more firmly into a gap near the window frame. It helps only slightly. The wind outside continues probing the cabin from every direction like a determined thief searching for weakness. You glance upward toward the ceiling beams where smoke gathers in pale shifting layers. Fireplaces in colonial homes provided heat and cooking space, but they also filled rooms with smoke surprisingly often, according to surviving household accounts from the period. Many cabins remained hazy indoors throughout winter because chimneys drafted poorly during certain weather conditions. Your eyes sting faintly. Nobody else seems bothered anymore. They adapted long ago. The younger child finally falls asleep beside the dog, still wrapped tightly in blankets. Her brother remains awake near the hearth, carving absent-minded patterns into a scrap of wood using the sharpened knife from earlier. Small curls of pale pine drop onto the floorboards between his boots. The mother continues sewing. Needle through cloth. Pull thread tight. Needle through cloth again. The rhythm almost becomes hypnotic. Outside, wind rattles something loose near the roof. A soft tapping sound follows every few moments. You imagine how unsettling nights must have felt before modern insulation, electric lighting, or reliable heating. Darkness carried texture here, sound carried meaning, and cold carried authority. A curious detail from several colonial diaries mentions people occasionally waking to discover drinking water frozen solid beside their beds, which feels less like quaint historical hardship and more like nature filing a formal complaint against human settlement. The father notices you staring toward the walls. "Colder near January," he mutters quietly. That single sentence somehow contains generations of experience. No complaining, no drama, just acceptance. Winter comes, walls leak cold, life continues. You move slightly closer to the hearth yourself. The warmth reaches your knees while your shoulders remain chilled. Colonial cabins often created strange pockets of temperature, where one part of the body roasted and another slowly transformed into decorative ice sculpture. The older boy suddenly glances towards the chimney. "You hear that?" Everyone pauses. At first you hear only firewood cracking softly, then something else, a long, low whistle slipping through the wind outside. The mother dismisses it immediately as air moving through trees, though her voice sounds a touch too quick. The father listens another moment before returning his attention to the fires. People in isolated settlements developed deep awareness of nighttime sounds because there were so few distractions competing against them. No engines, no distant traffic, no humming electricity. Every creak stood alone in the dark. Some researchers believe this heightened sensitivity helped strengthen supernatural beliefs during colonial winters. A branch scratching the roof at midnight could become an omen by morning, after passing through 3 exhausted imaginations and 1 nervous tavern conversation. The dog lifts its head again. Not barking. Not barking. Just listening. You are beginning to understand why frontier families valued dogs so highly. Half companion, half alarm system, half emotional support therapist during blizzards. Yes, that is technically 3 halves, but colonial math feels flexible after dark. The mother finishes mending one sock and holds it toward the candlelight for inspection. She nods faintly with satisfaction before reaching for another garment from the growing pile beside her chair. Nothing here truly rests. Not clothing, not tools, not people. Everything must remain useful. The fire dims again. Another log disappears into the flames. You notice the father studying the remaining wood stacked near the hearth. Firewood management dominated winter survival in ways modern households rarely consider. Running short could become catastrophic very quickly, especially during severe storms when outdoor travel became dangerous. Several settlements kept records of winters where families slept in shifts simply to maintain fires through the night. Imagine that exhaustion for a moment. Not sleeping because the weather might kill everyone if the flames weaken too far. The older boy finishes carving his piece of wood at last. It turns out to be a tiny animal. Rough but recognizable. He hands it quietly to his sleeping sister and leaves it beside her blanket. The gesture feels small, and somehow enormous. Outside, snow taps softly against the cabin walls. The sound reminds you faintly of fingers brushing paper. Somewhere deeper in town, another dog barks once, answered moments later by a second farther away. Then silence returns. You study the cabin more carefully now that the candle burns lower. The walls are unevenly fitted. The floorboards show gaps near the corners. Moisture stains darken parts of the ceiling. Even better constructed colonial homes struggled constantly against weather damage. A number of architectural historians point out that early settlements often relied on hurried construction methods because survival demanded immediate shelter rather than lasting beauty. Function first, elegance later, preferably much later. The mother finally sets her sewing aside and stretches tired fingers toward the fire. Her hands look reddened from cold water and constant labour. You remember hearing earlier that women frequently worked later into the evening than anyone else inside colonial households. Watching her now, that feels undeniably true. She still rises twice before sitting again. Once to check the kettle, once to hang damp gloves closer to the warmth. Even rest here arrives in fragments. The father removes his boots near the hearth and rubs one foot briefly with a grimace. Frostbite and chilblains troubled many colonists during harsh winters, especially labourers spending long hours outdoors. Medical treatment remained inconsistent enough that hope for improvement probably counted as an official healthcare strategy. The candle flame shortens further. Shadows deepen along the walls. The older boy yawns openly now before spreading blankets near the fire for sleeping. The family prepares for night with quiet efficiency born from repetition. Every movement feels familiar. Blankets laid out carefully, boots positioned close enough to remain warm but not scorched beside the hearth. Water bucket checked once more before sleep. You notice no one truly relaxes completely, not even indoors. Part of them continues listening to the weather, and as another cold draft slips through the timber walls while snow swirls endlessly outside the cabin, you begin listening too. The blankets come out one by one beside the hearth while the fire settles into deeper orange coals. Night has fully taken hold outside now. The windows show nothing except blackness interrupted occasionally by drifting snowflakes brushing the oiled paper covering. Inside the cabin, everyone moves more slowly. The younger girl sleeps curled beside the dog with one hand tangled loosely in its thick fur. The animal barely reacts anymore. Frontier dogs spent their lives surrounded by children climbing over them like determined little mountain goats. The older boy spreads another blanket across the floorboards near the fire. You notice immediately how thin it looks. Colonial blankets rarely resemble the soft, oversized things modern people drag dramatically across couches during winter streaming marathons. Many were heavy wool, scratchy linen, or patched layers reused for years. Contemporary records from the colonies describe families sleeping beneath multiple coverings at once, simply to hold enough warmth through freezing nights. The mother kneels beside the sleeping girl and adjusts the blanket carefully around her shoulders. You hear the child coughing softly. Not severe, still enough to make everyone glance over instinctively. Illness haunted colonial winters constantly. Cold weather trapped families together indoors where coughs, fevers, and infections spread easily through crowded cabins. Without antibiotics or reliable medicine, even ordinary sickness carried unsettling uncertainties. The father notices your expression. "She's stronger than last winter," he says quietly. You are not entirely reassured by the wording. The mother places heated stones wrapped in cloth beneath the blankets near the children's feet. The warmth rises slowly through the bedding. Some households used warming pans filled with hot coals for similar purposes, though those occasionally scorched sheets or frightened people half awake at midnight when something started smelling suspiciously smoky, which honestly feels like a very stressful bedtime tradition. The candlelight flickers lower again. You begin understanding why colonial evenings often ended earlier than modern nights. Light itself required effort. Candles cost money. Firewood disappeared quickly once darkness settled deeply enough. Sleep became one of the few affordable activities left available. The father checks the door latch twice before returning to the hearth. Not from fear exactly, just habit. Settlements remained vulnerable places during winter. Storms damaged buildings, travellers arrived unexpectedly. Animals wandered close searching for food. Safety felt practical rather than guaranteed. The older boy finally lies down near the fire, still wearing most of his clothes. That detail catches your attention at first, though it made perfect sense historically. Many colonists slept partially dressed during winter because cabins became so cold overnight. Removing layers simply meant regretting every life decision around 3 in the morning. You pull your own blanket tighter, while the fire crackles softly nearby. Smoke drifts lazily upward. The room smells of ash, wool, damp leather, and faint pine resin from freshly cut logs, and outside, the wind eases for a while. The sudden quiet almost feels louder. A curious account from the early colonies tells of families hanging thick cloth around beds to trap warmth during severe cold spells. These primitive bed curtains helped hold heat surprisingly well, though they also transformed sleeping spaces into tiny fabric caves where several people breathed the same smoky air all night long. Cozy in theory, slightly medieval in practice. The mother sits briefly beside the fire at last. For the first time all evening, she appears still. Her shoulders lower slowly as warmth reaches her hands. The father leans back against the wall nearby with tired eyes fixed on the glowing coals. Nobody speaks for several minutes. The silence feels comfortable now. You listen to tiny sounds filling the cabin. Blankets rustling softly. Wood settling in the walls. The younger child breathing through sleep. A kettle clicking faintly as cooling metal contracts beside the hearth. Colonial nights contained extraordinary texture once you stopped expecting modern noise. Some social historians suggest families in this period likely developed stronger awareness of one another's moods simply because they shared so much physical space. Privacy barely existed inside many homes. Everyone heard every cough, every whispered conversation, every restless movement during the night. The older boy turns over beneath his blanket. The dog sighs heavily, and somewhere outside near the trees, a distant howl rises through the darkness. The sound freezes the room instantly. Not panic. Recognition. The father lifts his head slightly and listens. Another howl answers farther away. Wolves remained present in parts of colonial America during the early 18th century, especially around forests and unsettled regions. Most attacks on humans proved rare, but livestock losses frightened communities regularly. Nighttime howling became part of winter soundscapes many settlers knew intimately. The younger girl stirs in her sleep. The mother reaches down and rests a hand lightly against her back until she settles again. You realize children here probably learned very early that darkness carried real dangers, not imaginary ones invented for campfire stories. Cold alone could kill, isolation could kill, Illness could kill, even getting lost briefly during a storm could become catastrophic. And somehow families still built ordinary lives inside all that uncertainty. The father finally tosses another small log onto the coals. He does not add much wood now. Fires needed careful management through the night. Too little warmth risked freezing temperatures indoors. Too much fuel wasted precious supplies before morning. Everything in colonial winter life balanced on narrow margins. The candle burns almost completely down. Soon only firelight remains. Shadows stretch taller across the cabin walls while the corners darken into soft blackness. You can barely see the shelves anymore. Only the faint shapes of hanging herbs and tools remain visible above the hearth. The mother closes her eyes briefly where she sits. Not asleep yet. Just resting. Another soft cough comes from beneath the blankets. The father stares into the fire, perhaps counting silently towards spring. Many colonists measured winter psychologically as much as physically. Letters and journals from the era often mention emotional exhaustion by late January and February, when cold weather dragged endlessly onward. Snow turned roads impassable. Supplies grew thinner. Cabin fever settled heavily over households trapped indoors. You understand that feeling tonight. The cabin no longer seems quaint or adventurous. It feels fragile, human, warm only because several exhausted people work constantly to keep it that way. Outside, snow continues drifting quietly across the sleeping settlement while the last candle flame finally disappears into darkness. The wolves do not howl again for several minutes. That almost makes the silence whoa. You lie beneath heavy wool blankets near the fire while the cabin settles around you in layers of creaks and whispers. The flames have weakened now into deep glowing embers pulsing softly beneath charred logs. Their warmth reaches only partway across the room. Your face feels warm. Your feet absolutely do not. Outside, winter presses against the settlement from every direction. You can sense it beyond the walls even without seeing it. Snow buried along fences, ice thickening near the riverbank, bare tree branches rattling beneath moonlight. And somewhere beyond those trees, things move. The dog hears something first. Its ears rise slowly while the rest of the body remains still. The animal does not bark. That somehow feels more serious. The father notices immediately. He lifts his head from the wall and listens into the darkness. You hear it a moment later, crunching snow. Faint, rhythmic, then nothing again. The cabin remains perfectly still while everyone listens. Colonial settlements existed close enough to wilderness that nighttime visitors were common. Deer wandered near homes searching for food. Foxes circled chicken coops. Wolves occasionally approached livestock pens during hard winters. Every sound beyond the walls demanded attention because people could not simply assume safety. The older boy whispers something about raccoons. The father quietly replies that raccoons do not usually travel this far in deep snow, which is not particularly comforting at bedtime. The mother pulls another blanket over the sleeping girl and glances toward the musket hanging near the door. Firearms served practical purposes in colonial life far beyond hunting. Many households kept weapons close during winter night simply because help from neighbors might take too long in dangerous situations. The crunching sound returns briefly. Closer this time. The dog finally growls low in its throat. Not loud, just enough. You hold still beside the fire, listening carefully while wind brushes softly along the outer walls. Then suddenly a shadow passes the window covering. Everyone freezes. The father rises immediately. The musket comes down from its pegs with smooth, practiced movement. No panic, just caution sharpened through experience. He steps toward the window carefully and waits. Another sound follows outside. Sniffing, then scraping near the wall, and finally the truth reveals itself through one extremely rude goat. Apparently someone's livestock escaped the pen again and decided midnight exploration sounded appealing. The father exhales slowly while the older boy laughs under his breath. Even the mother smiles faintly before shaking her head. The dog looks mildly offended at the entire situation. Honestly fair. A small but fascinating detail from colonial records describes how animals frequently wandered directly into settlements during severe winters searching for food or warmth. Farmers complained constantly about escaped pigs, goats, and chickens causing chaos at inconvenient hours. Human civilization apparently spent centuries one loose goat away from disaster. The father secures the musket again before stepping briefly outside into the cold. The door opens only a crack, yet icy air rushes across the cabin immediately. Snowflakes swirl through the gap before the door shuts once more behind him. You hear some muffled footsteps outside. A soft curse, then the unmistakable sound of a stubborn animal refusing cooperation. Some things truly transcend history. Inside, the mother stirs the embers gently with an iron poker. Tiny sparks rise and vanish into darkness above the hearth. The room glows red and gold again for a moment before dimming once more. The younger child wakes halfway. "Wolf," she whispers sleepily. "Goat," the older boy replies. She falls asleep again almost instantly. Apparently satisfied, this explanation places the evening safely below catastrophe level. You settle deeper beneath the blankets while the wind shifts direction outside. The cabin groans softly beneath the pressure. Every board seems alive tonight. A number of historians specializing in early colonial settlements continued debating how isolated families mentally handled long winters with limited social contact. Some argue strong communal traditions helped enormously. Others believe loneliness and anxiety were far more common than surviving records openly admit. Lying here tonight, it is easy imagining both possibilities at once. The father returns finally with snow dusted across his shoulders. He stomps ice from his boots near the door before crouching beside the hearth again. His beard glitters faintly with melting frosts. "Fence broke loose," he mutters quietly. "Of course it did. Winter destroys everything, eventually." The older boy asks whether more snow's coming. The father glances toward the chimney where wind whistles faintly. Before morning, nobody seems surprised. The mother hands him a small cup of cider warmed beside the embers. Steam curls upward through the dim cabin air. For a few moments, no one speaks again. You begin noticing how carefully colonial families preserved calm during difficult nights. Fear wastes energy. Panic solves little. Winter already demands enough from everyone without adding unnecessary drama. Outside, another strange sound rises faintly through the woods. Not wolves this time. Branches cracking. Long slow groans from heavy trees shifting beneath ice and cold. Settlers unfamiliar with winter forests sometimes found these noises deeply unsettling. Frozen timber expands and contracts dramatically during severe cold, creating sharp reports that echo surprisingly far at night. To exhausted colonists listening from dark cabins, forests occasionally sounded enormous and alive. The older boy claims once hearing a tree split completely in half during January. His mother tells him not to exaggerate. He insists he is not exaggerating. Honestly, you suspect the tree probably exploded with full theatrical commitment. The fire burns lower still. Now the room depends mostly on glowing coals rather than open flames. Shadows soften around the edges. Blankets rise and fall gently with sleeping breaths. Outside the settlement, snow drifts silently across dark fields and frozen paths. The tavern windows have likely gone dark by now. Travellers settled into cold lofts above stables. Horses stamp restlessly in barns heavy with hay and frost. And everywhere across the colony, families listen to the same winter sounds. Wind through trees, ice shifting along rivers, animals moving in darkness, cabin walls creaking softly through the night. You close your eyes briefly while the dog settles down again near the children. Its breathing slows. The goat incident has apparently concluded without further diplomatic complications. Still, even now, part of you keeps listening toward the woods, just in case. The cabin grows colder sometime after midnight. Not suddenly, just gradually enough that you first notice it in your hands, then your nose, then the narrow strip of skin exposed between blanket and collar. The fire has collapsed inward into low, glowing embers that pulse faintly beneath layers of ash. Every few moments, one tiny flame flickers upward before disappearing again. Beside you, the older boy sleeps, curled tightly beneath wool blankets with his knees tucked close against the cold. The dog lies pressed against the children for warmth, breathing slowly through sleep. Across the room, the father remains awake. You realise this after hearing soft movement near the hearth. He crouches beside the coals, using the poker carefully, stirring hidden heat back to life without fully feeding the fire yet. That balancing act mattered enormously during colonial winters. Burn wood too quickly and supplies vanish before spring. Burn too little and people wake shivering beneath frost. The cabin smells heavier at night. Ash, smoke trapped in fabric, damp wool drying too slowly, and the faint sourness of too many people breathing in one enclosed space for too many hours. Nobody mentioned it because everyone smells exactly the same. The father adds a single split leg, not two, not three, just enough. Small flames spread slowly through the wood, while sparks drift upward toward the chimney. The light paints soft orange shapes across the ceiling beams. You can finally see your own breath faintly in the colder corners of the room. Travel journals from the colonies frequently mention indoor frost forming, along walls or windows during severe winters. Some homes remained only slightly warmer inside than outside once fires weakened overnight. Comfort existed on a sliding scale that modern central heating has completely erased from human memory. The father wraps his coat tighter around himself before sitting again. He does not wake anyone. That feels deliberate. Parents in difficult times often become quiet guardians of sleep itself. Outside, wind brushes gently across the roof. The storm from earlier seems to have moved farther east now. In its place comes deep stillness settling over the settlement. You imagine the tavern gone dark, the roads buried beneath fresh snow, the river frozen beneath moonlight somewhere beyond the trees. The younger girl coughs again in her sleep. The mother wakes instantly. Not fully, just enough to listen. After a moment, the child settles back into steady breathing, and the mother closes her eyes once more beneath the blankets. You begin understanding how lightly colonial families often slept during winter. Too many things required attention. Fires, sick children, strange sounds outdoors, roof damage during storms. A peaceful, uninterrupted 8 hours probably sounded as mythical as dragons. An odd but genuine custom from parts of early colonial society involved people sleeping in 2 separate phases during long winter nights. Some records describe individuals waking naturally for an hour or two after midnight before returning to sleep later. During those quiet waking periods, people prayed, repaired tools, checked fires, or simply sat thinking beside the embers. Honestly, considering the amount of smoke inhalation happening in this cabin, everyone may also have just been mildly dizzy all the time. The older boy shifts suddenly beneath the blankets and mutters something unintelligible before going still again. Dreaming, perhaps. You wonder what colonial children dreamed about. Not smartphones, certainly. Probably forests. Snow, animals, maybe warmer weather. The fire crackles softly while the father stares into it without speaking. His face looks older in the low light. Hard winters aged people quickly. Constant outdoor labour, limited nutrition, illness, and stress left visible marks across entire communities. Several historians specialising in colonial health have noted that many settlers likely experienced chronic physical discomfort most of their lives. Bad teeth, aching joints, lingering infections, smoke-irritated lungs, cold-damaged skin, yet daily work continued regardless. Rest was rarely complete. The wind changes direction again outside. A thin whistle slips through gaps in the wall near the roofline. You hear snow brushing faintly across the exterior logs. Somewhere in the distance, a horse stamps inside its stable. Then comes another sound. Church bells. Very faint. You lift your head slightly beneath the blanket. The father hears them too. A few slow strikes drifting through the frozen darkness from the centre of town. Not alarm bells, just time passing. Colonial settlements often relied on church bells for communication, marking hours, announcing gatherings, or warning communities during emergencies. Sound travelled remarkably far during winter nights when cold air sharpened everything. The bells fade again into the silence. For several long moments, all you hear is breathing and fire. The cabin feels suspended outside of ordinary time now. Darkness stretches endlessly beyond the walls, while everyone inside exists within this small circle of dim warmth and drifting smoke. The father eventually stands once more and crosses quietly toward the door. He opens it slightly. Cold air floods indoors immediately, sharp enough to sting. You glimpse the outside world only for a second, snow glowing pale beneath moonlight, fence posts half buried in drifts, chimney smoke rising straight upward into the frozen sky. Then the door closes again. The father brushes snow from his sleeve before returning to the fire. "Clear tonight," he murmurs softly. That matters somehow. Clear skies usually mean colder temperatures before dawn. The older boy wakes briefly and reaches sleepy hands toward the warmth before falling back asleep almost immediately. The dog does not even bother opening its eyes anymore. Frontier dogs appear to conserve emotional energy wisely. A surviving letter from a New England colonist once described winter nights as feeling without end during particularly severe seasons. You understand that phrase now. Darkness here carries enormous length. Midnight feels ancient rather than temporary. The mother finally rises halfway from her blankets and places another warmed stone near the younger child's feet. Even half asleep, she remembers. That detail stays with you. Love during difficult winters often looked practical rather than poetic. Extra firewood, repaired gloves, warm stones beneath blankets, someone staying awake while others sleep. The fire glows brighter for a few moments before settling once again into quiet red coals beyond the cabin walls. The frozen settlement sleeps beneath snow and stars while the long colonial night continues inching slowly toward dawn. The hours after midnight feel different from the rest of the night. Quieter, slower, almost unreal. The fire has burned low enough now that the cabin glows mostly in deep reddish shadows. Shapes blur softly together across the room. Blankets rise and fall with sleeping breaths, while frost thickens around the edges of the window covering. You remain awake beside the fading embers, listening. Colonial nights encouraged listening whether people wanted to or not. There was little else to do in darkness this complete. The father dozes lightly against the wall near the hearth, though one eye seems perpetually prepared to open if the fire weakens too far. The mother sleeps curled beside the younger child, with one protective arm stretched across the blankets. Outside, the woods creak again. Long, slow, like something enormous shifting its weight beyond the settlements. The older boy opens his eyes immediately. "You hear the walking trees," he whispers. The father answers without fully waking. "Trees don't walk." The boy says nothing after that, though you suspect the matter remains unresolved in his mind. Stories flourish during colonial winters, partly because darkness gave imagination too much room to wander. In isolated settlements where people spent long evenings near dim fires, folklore blended naturally with ordinary experience. Strange sounds became warnings. Shadows gained personalities. Entire communities passed stories from cabin to cabin until rumour and memory tangle together like roots beneath snow. The boy sits up slightly beneath his blanket. "My cousin says spirits cross the river in winter," he murmurs quietly. The mother opens one eye immediately. "No ghost talk tonight." Apparently this conversation has happened before. A fascinating note from early American folklore describes settlers placing protective objects near doors or hearths during certain seasons to ward off bad luck or wandering spirits. Some customs came from European traditions carried across the Atlantic, while others evolved locally through generations of colonial storytelling. Human beings, it turns out, remain extremely committed to being nervous in the dark. The older boy lowers his voice further anyway. He claims a woman in another settlement heard knocking beneath her cabin floor all winter long, until spring revealed nothing there at all. The younger girl, unfortunately awake again now, immediately disappears deeper beneath her blanket. The father sighs. It was mice. The boy hesitates. Big mice. Honestly, that question changes absolutely nothing in a comforting direction. The dog suddenly lifts its head again, staring toward the darkest corner near the storage barrels. Everyone follows its gaze for one deeply uncomfortable second before a tiny scratching sound reveals the culprit. Mouse, very small, emotionally confident. The mother tosses a scrap of cloth toward the corner and the scratching stops instantly. Colonial homes struggle constantly with rodents during winter. Food stores attracted mice, especially once snow-covered fields outside. Many households accepted a certain level of unwanted furry roommates as unavoidable seasonal reality. Still unsettling at midnight, though. The fire sinks lower again while the father adds another small log. Smoke curls lazily upward through the dim cabin air. You notice the smell more strongly now. Burned pine, ash, damp timber warming slowly near the hearth. And beneath it all, the earthy scent of winter clothing drying after days of snow and labour. The older boy continues whispering, despite his parents clearly wanting sleep. He tells you another story now. Apparently travellers sometimes saw lantern lights moving deep in the woods during storms where no roads existed. Some believe these lights belonged to wandering spirits. Others blamed smugglers, lost hunters, or lonely settlers losing track of distance in heavy snow. Modern historians examining colonial folklore often point out how frequently fear mixed with a practical danger. Forests genuinely were hazardous places at night. Travellers disappeared. Storms erased trails. Under those conditions, supernatural explanations sometimes grew naturally from very real risks. The younger girl asked quietly whether witches live nearby. The mother answers before anyone else can. No, too fast again. Interesting. The Salem witch trials ended only a little more than a decade earlier. That memory still lingered heavily across parts of colonial society in 1704. Fear of witchcraft had not vanished simply because the trials ended. Suspicion and superstition survived much longer than official panic. The father rubs tired eyes before finally speaking. My grandfather swore he heard singing once during a storm. The older boy immediately sits straighter. The mother gives her husband a deeply unimpressed look. He shrugs slightly. Singing from the river? Now even you're interested. The father explains that years earlier, before this settlement existed, travellers camped near frozen water during a severe winter storm. Late at night, strange voices drifted across the ice sounding almost musical. What was it? The younger girl whispers. Ice shifting, the mother answers firmly. The father nods after a moment. Probably is not exactly the same as definitely. Frozen lakes and rivers produce astonishing noises during temperature changes. Booming cracks, distant hums, eerie vibrations. To colonists hearing these sounds without scientific explanation, winter landscapes sometimes felt haunted in very convincing ways. The wind rises outside once more. Snow brushes softly against the walls. Then somewhere farther away across the sleeping settlement, another sound drifts faintly through the darkness. A baby crying, thin, tired, followed by someone coughing hard enough to echo briefly between cabins. The room grows quieter afterward, because beneath all the ghost stories and strange sounds lived more immediate fears. Illness, cold, hunger, loss. Winter did not need supernatural help to frighten people. The father stares into the fire a while before speaking again, more softly this time. Spring comes eventually. Nobody answers immediately, but you can feel everyone listening there. Listening to those words. A surprising number of colonial letters and journals mention emotional relief once winter finally loosened its grip. After months of darkness and confinement, the first signs of thaw often carried enormous psychological importance. Dripping snowmelt, birds returning, softer air through cabin doors, small changes felt almost miraculous. The younger girl finally drifts back asleep. The older boy settles beneath his blankets once more. Even the dog curls tight against the warmth. The father remains awake longest beside the embers, while shadows shift quietly across the cabin walls. Outside, the frozen wood stands silent beneath moonlight and snow, keeping their strange noises and old stories hidden among the trees until morning. The cabin sleeps lightly around you, while the final hours before dawn creep slowly through the frozen settlement. Outside, the wind has weakened again, leaving behind a strange heavy stillness that settles over the snow like a thick blanket. Inside, however, the work never truly ends. The mother wakes first, not because morning has arrived, not because she's rested, simply because something always needs doing. You hear the faint rustle of blankets as she carefully slips free without waking the children beside her. The fire has nearly collapsed into ash now, giving only a dim reddish glow across the floorboards. Cold lingers everywhere beyond arm's reach of the hearth. She kneels immediately beside the embers. Tiny sparks leap upward as she feeds the fire with practiced patience. Small kindling first, thin strips of split wood, careful breaths coaxing heat back into the room. Within minutes, the flames begin climbing again, weak but alive. You realise how much colonial household depended on invisible labour like this. Fires did not maintain themselves, clothes did not mend themselves, food did not appear automatically from cupboards stocked by grocery stores and optimistic marketing campaigns featuring cheerful bread. Everything required effort, constant effort. A great many surviving household records from early America reveal that women's work stretched far beyond daylight hours. Winter especially increased domestic labour because cooking, washing, heating water, preserving food, and repairing clothing all became more difficult in freezing weather. The mother moves quietly across the room, checking boots left near the hearth overnight. She turns them closer toward the warmth, so frozen leather softens slightly before morning chores begin. Then she hangs damp gloves higher beside the chimney. Then she checks the kettle. Then the blankets covering the younger child. Even now, before sunrise, she has already completed more tasks than most modern people accomplish before aggressively negotiating with coffee machines. The father still sleeps against the wall near the fire, though not deeply. Years of hard winters appear to have trained him into permanent readiness. The older boy snores faintly beneath his blanket while the dog twitches through some dream involving either rabbits or emotional revenge against goats. The mother opens a storage chest quietly. Inside rests the family's winter survival in miniature. Dried beans, salted pork wrapped in cloth, cornmeal, a small precious pouch of tea. You notice how carefully she measures everything. Colonial families often rationed supplies tightly by late winter, when food stores began shrinking faster than weather improved. February and March could become especially difficult because preserved goods ran low long before fresh crops returned. She removes only enough cornmeal for breakfast, nothing extra. A little-known practice from some colonial kitchens involved saving every possible crumb or cooking scrap for future meals. Bones became broth, stale bread thickened soups, animal fat transformed into candles or cooking grease. Wastefulness carried real consequences during hard winters. The fire brightens slowly while shadows retreat from the corners of the cabin. Smoke drifts upward in twisting pale ribbons. The smell changes again, too. Fresh wood burning, warm ash, and soon cornmeal heating inside an iron pot. The mother finally sits for a moment beside the hearth, rubbing warmth back into her hands. You notice her knuckles are cracked from cold weather and constant washing. Water had to be carried, heated, reused carefully, and often hauled again through snow and ice. Even basic cleaning became exhausting during winter months. Outside, a rooster crows somewhere across the settlement. Far too early. Colonial roosters apparently shared the same chaotic commitment to ruining sleep schedules as modern alarm clocks. The father wakes almost immediately afterward. He says nothing at first, just reaches automatically toward the fire, checking its strength with sleepy eyes before nodding faintly. The mother hands him a cup of warm cider without needing to ask. Small routines like this probably carried enormous emotional comfort through difficult seasons. Some social historians believe long winters strengthened family cooperation because survival depended so heavily on shared labour. Others caution that crowded conditions and constant stress likely created frequent tensions hidden beneath polite records and religious language. Honestly, both feel true. Human beings rarely become saints simply because snow exists. The father pulls on stiff boots while the mother begins mixing dough for coarse bread. Her movements remain steady despite obvious exhaustion. You wonder how many colonial women quietly carried entire households forward while everyone else slept. The older boy finally wakes next. He sits upright suddenly as though remembering responsibilities before fully remembering consciousness itself. Within minutes he is outside collecting more wood despite darkness still lingering beyond the windows. Cold air floods indoors briefly when the door opens. Sharp, clean, painfully fresh after hours of smoke-filled air. You glimpse pale snow beneath fading moonlight before the door shuts again. The younger child remains asleep near the dog, cheeks pink from fire warmth. The mother lets her rest longer. Childhood in colonial America often included work from very young ages, especially in farming households, but parents still protected sleep whenever possible during harsh winters. The kettle begins rattling softly now. Breakfast smells spread through the cabin. Simple smells. Warm ones. A surviving diary from New England describes winter mornings beginning in smoke and darkness before God sends light again. That line feels remarkably accurate here. Dawn arrives slowly in colonial winters, especially inside cabins where tiny windows admit little sunlight even during daytime. The father finally speaks while tightening his coat. "River will freeze solid soon." The mother nods without looking up from the dough. That statement carries practical implications immediately. Easier crossings, perhaps? Harder fishing? Greater danger for children tempted onto unstable ice? Every weather change altered daily life. The older boy returns carrying an armful of wood dusted with snow. His face glows red from cold air while steam rises faintly from his shoulders near the fire. The dog wakes fully at last and stretches with dramatic theatrical groaning as though personally burdened by colonial hardship. "Honesty!" Outside, darkness slowly softens toward grey. The settlement begins stirring awake cabin by cabin beneath drifting smoke and fresh snow. Somewhere nearby another door opens. Someone coughs. An axe strikes wood in slow, steady rhythm. Morning approaches, and already the women of the colony have been awake for hours, keeping winter at bay one small task at a time. The sky outside the cabin slowly fades from black to deep blue-grey, while the settlement wakes beneath fresh snow. Smoke rises from chimneys in soft, crooked lines, drifting low across rooftops before dissolving into the icy morning air. Inside, breakfast disappears quickly. Cornmeal porridge, a little bread, warm cider thinned carefully to make supplies last. Nobody lingers over the meal because winter mornings leave little room for laziness. Animals require feeding, fires require tending, water must be hauled before the cold deepens again. Yet today, instead of remaining inside the cabin, you follow the father down the narrow lane toward the tavern at the centre of town. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots. The cold feels cleaner this morning after the long, smoky night indoors. Your lungs sting slightly with every breath. Frost gathers instantly along scarves and coat collars while the settlement creaks awake around you. A woman sweeps snow from her doorway using a rough pine broom. Two boys drag firewood across the street on a small sled. Farther away, someone argues loudly with a chicken. Colonial mornings truly offered something for everyone. The tavern appears sturdier in daylight, though only slightly. Snow clings thickly along the roofline while frozen mud hardens around the entrance. Horses tied nearby stamp impatiently against the cold, sending clouds of steam into the air. When the door opens, warmth rolls outward, carrying scents of ale, wet wool, pipe smoke, and frying onions. You step inside gratefully. The room already hums with quiet conversation despite the early hour. Travellers hunch near the hearth, thawing stiff hands around mugs, while local men exchange news gathered from roads, docks, and neighbouring settlements. Colonial taverns functioned as far more than drinking establishments. Many served as post offices, meeting spaces, temporary courts, political centres, and informal newspapers, all combined into one smoky building filled with exhausted people and questionable furniture. You remove your gloves near the fire while snow melts slowly from your boots. The tavern keeper moves constantly through the room, balancing bowls, mugs, and firewood with astonishing efficiency. His apron smells permanently of smoke and beer. Behind him, several candles still burn despite daylight outside because tavern interiors remain dim even during mornings. The father exchanges greetings with another man seated near the hearth. A trapper by the look of him. Heavy fur coat, wind-burnted face, eyes permanently narrowed from staring across snowfields for too many winters. He mentions wolves near the northern trails again, though this time the conversation remains practical rather than eerie. Livestock losses apparently increased after recent storms drove animals closer to settlements. Then someone else mentioned sickness spreading in another town farther south. The room quiets slightly after that. Information travelled slowly through the colonies, but taverns accelerated rumour almost professionally. News arrived through merchants, sailors, travellers, ministers, and anyone else surviving long enough to reach a warm building with listeners inside. One surviving account from the early 18th century describes taverns as places where all stories grow taller by the second mug. Human nature apparently required very little evolution before becoming recognisable. The trapper beside the fire begins describing a winter journey through deep forest snow. According to him, temperatures dropped so sharply one night that tree trunks cracked like musket fire across the woods. Nobody doubts this. Extreme cold genuinely caused such sounds. Still, the younger serving girl nearby looks deeply uncomfortable hearing it before sunrise. A scholar examining colonial travel journals once observed that winter journeys often felt psychologically isolating in ways modern travellers struggle to imagine. Roads vanished beneath snow, storms erased tracks, dense forests surrounded travellers for miles without visible settlements or reliable shelter. You glance toward the tavern windows. Outside, snow still covers everything. Even in daylight, the wilderness feels close. The trapper eventually laughs and admits the cold frightened him less than sleeping beside another traveller who snored loudly enough to attract bears. Reasonable concern, honestly. At a nearby table, several men debate politics between mouthfuls of stew. Voices remain careful but intense. Colonial taverns regularly hosted discussions about taxes, trade laws, land disputes, and relations with England. Winter nights especially encouraged long conversations because darkness arrived early and outdoor labour slowed. The tavern keeper eventually places a hot drink into your hands. Mulled cider this time. The steam smells of apple, spice, and smoke. Simple warmth becomes deeply satisfying after enough cold exposure. Colonial life repeatedly reduced happiness into practical categories. Dry socks, strong roofs, warm food, fires that survive until morning. Luxury changes definition remarkably fast during winter. Near the back wall, an older sailor begins telling a bizarre story involving frozen beer barrels exploding aboard a ship near Boston Harbor. Whether true or not remains difficult to determine. Taverns specialized in confident storytelling. Another curious historical detail from colonial America involves some taverns renting shared beds to multiple travelers at once during busy seasons. Complete strangers occasionally slept side by side simply because indoor warmth mattered more than privacy, which sounds absolutely horrifying to modern introverts. You imagine trying to explain personal boundaries to a freezing sailor in 1704 and receiving nothing but aggressive confusion. The father finishes his drink slowly while listening to conversations around the room. Much of colonial social life depended on spaces exactly like this one. Taverns connected isolated settlements together through information and human contact during long winters. Outside, church bells ring faintly across town. Morning advances. More travellers enter shaking snow from coats while others prepare to leave before roads worsen again. The door opens and closes constantly, each burst of cold air cutting briefly through the warmth inside. Yet despite the noise, despite the smoke, despite the crowded benches and damp clothing steaming beside the hearth, the tavern feels comforting, alive. A temporary refuge against winter. You sit quietly near the fire, listening to voices overlap beneath low timber beams while snow continues drifting past the windows outside. And for the first time since arriving in the colony, you understand why people gathered here night after night beneath candlelight and smoke. Not simply for drink, for company. The warmth of the tavern changes once the conversation turns toward illness. You notice it immediately. Voices lower, mugs pause halfway to lips. Even the fire seems quieter somehow beneath the heavy timber beams. The trapper near the hearth mutters something about fever spreading along settlements farther south. Another man claims 3 children in a nearby village fell sick after Christmas. A woman carrying bread to one of the table crosses herself quickly before continuing toward the kitchen. Winter sickness frightened colonial communities deeply because medicine remained uncertain, inconsistent, and often terrifying in its own right. You sit closer to the fire while snow swirls faintly outside the windows. The tavern keeper adds another log to the hearth, and sparks leap upward into smoke-darkened air. No one here speaks dramatically. That almost makes it worse. People in the colonies understood disease intimately. Smallpox, influenza, dysentery, pneumonia, and countless unnamed fevers moved through settlements with frightening speed. Cold weather trapped families indoors together, where illness spread easily through crowded cabins and shared bedding. A physician in early colonial America might prescribe herbal remedies, bloodletting, purging, alcohol, prayer, or combinations of all 5 depending entirely on mood and available equipment. Modern medicine would have looked like sorcery to them. Their medicine sometimes looks like sorcery to us. The father beside you listens carefully while tightening his coat around himself. The trapper mentions one settlement where an entire household fell ill after a traveller arrived during a storm. By the time neighbours realised how serious things had become, the sickness had already spread across several cabins. Nobody interrupts him. Diseased as story is, carried a grim familiarity. At another table, an older sailor quietly claims he trusts onion broth more than doctors. Someone else insists vinegar or wards off winter fever if rubbed along the chest before sleep. A fascinating but unsettling detail from this period involves people carrying small bundles of herbs or strong-smelling flowers near the face during war outbreaks, because many believe disease travelled through foul air. Without understanding germs, colonists often focused on odours as signs of danger, which means half the tavern technically qualifies as a public health emergency. The serving girl nearby coughs once into her sleeve. Half the room glances over instinctively. Fear worked quickly in isolated communities. You step briefly away from the crowded fire toward the window. Outside, the settlement appears peaceful beneath pale daylight. Smoke rises gently from chimneys, snow covers rooftops in clean white silence. Yet somewhere behind those cabin walls, people suffer quietly through fever and winter exhaustion. Colonial records contain countless references to sickness arriving hardest during colder months. Children especially remained vulnerable. Malnutrition, freezing temperatures, and poor sanitation weakened bodies already struggling against disease. The father eventually tells a story of a healer from years earlier who travelled between settlements during a severe outbreak carrying dried herbs, boiled willow bark, and little else. Did she help? Someone asks. He shrugs slightly. Some lived. Not exactly a medical endorsement. Still, communities relied heavily on practical local knowledge because trained physicians remained scarce outside larger towns. Women often served as nurses, midwives, herbalists, and caretakers during illness, handling most daily treatment inside homes. Near the tavern door, 2 travellers stamp snow from their boots before entering. One immediately asks whether the rumours about fever upriver are true. The room grows quieter again. News travelled unevenly across colonial America. By the time information reached distant settlements, stories often mixed fact, fear, and speculation together into one anxious bundle. Some researchers examining colonial mortality records believe winter illnesses may have felt psychologically worse because darkness and isolation magnified anxiety. A cough heard at midnight inside a freezing cabin could easily sound more dangerous when no doctor lived nearby and roads vanished beneath snow. You understand that completely now. Even the younger child coughing softly back at the cabin suddenly feels more serious in memory. The tavern keeper begins slicing bread behind the counter while conversation shifts briefly toward practical remedies. Garlic, onion syrup, heated stones near the fee, goose grease rubbed along the chest. One sailor insists hot beer cures nearly everything. That recommendation feels suspiciously self-serving. Outside, church bells ring faintly through the cold afternoon air. Their sound drifts across the snow-covered settlement like slow waves. You notice several people pause when they hear them. Churches played enormous roles during illness in colonial communities. Ministers visited the sick, organised aid, led funeral, and offered spiritual explanations for suffering that many people desperately needed during hard winters. The trapper beside the hearth eventually lowers his voice. He says a family farther north once nailed pine branches above their doorway during a fever outbreak, believing evil spirits feared evergreen plants. Whether anyone truly believed that or simply hoped desperately for comfort remains difficult to know. Human beings often create rituals during uncertain times because doing something feels easier than doing nothing. The father finally rises from the bench. "We should head back before dark," he says quietly. Wise decision. Colonial winter afternoons disappeared quickly. Roads became dangerous after sunset, especially during storms or deep freezes. You step outside the tavern and immediately the cold strikes your face hard enough to sting. Snow crunches beneath your boots while smoke drifts low between buildings. The settlement already feels dimmer despite the early hours. People move differently now too. Faster. Purposefully. A woman carries water buckets across the lane with her scarf wrapped tightly over nose and mouth. 2 boys drag a sled loaded with chopped wood. Somewhere nearby, another cough echoes faintly from behind cabin walls. Life continues regardless. That may be the most remarkable thing about colonial winters. Fear never stopped the ordinary rhythm of survival. Fires still needed tending. Animals still required feeding. Bread still had to be baked before nightfall. The father walks silently beside you through drifting snow while church bells fade behind the wind. Ahead, smoke curls upward from the family cabin where warmth, labour, and watchfulness wait once again against the long, cold evening approaching across the colony. The afternoon sky darkens early beneath thick winter clouds, while you walk beside the father towards the edge of the settlement. Snow squeaks beneath your boots with every step. The cold feels sharper now than it did this morning, as though the day itself has grown tired and impatient. Beyond the last cabins, the wilderness begins almost immediately. Tall trees stand frozen and silent along the ridge overlooking the river. Their branches hold fresh snow in heavy white layers, while the wind moves softly through pine needles somewhere high above. The father carries an axe over one shoulder. You suspect firewood gathering never truly ends in winter. The colony seems permanently one cold night away from another woodpile emergency. Ahead near the riverbank, smoke rises from a smaller camp tucked partly among the trees. Unlike the crowded colonial cabins back in town, these shelters blend more naturally into the landscape around them. Snow lies undisturbed nearby, except for narrow pathways packed firm by careful footsteps. The father slows respectfully as you approach. A man emerges from one of the shelters wearing layered furs and carrying several rabbits tied neatly together. His movements look calm and economical. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. They greet each other quietly. You notice immediately how different the camp smells compared to the settlement. Cleaner somehow, pine smoke, cold river air, animal hides, fresh wood, less rot, less crowding. Many colonists survived harsh winters only because indigenous communities shared critical knowledge about local food sources, shelter construction, hunting techniques, and seasonal survival. Early settlements often depended far more heavily on native expertise than colonial records comfortably admitted later. The man gestures toward the frozen river where fishing holes remain carefully maintained through the ice. You walk closer and immediately feel colder air rising from the dark water below. The openings look black and endless beneath the snow-covered surface. Nearby, strips of meat hang drying beside a fire pit carefully shielded from the wind. Everything here appears intentional, practical, balanced against winter rather than fighting it directly. The father kneels beside one of the traps set near the trees, while the other man examines tracks in the snow. You realize people living this close to wilderness read the landscape constantly. Broken branches, animal prints, wind direction, snow texture. The ground itself becomes conversation. A remarkable observation made by several colonial writers describes indigenous winter travel as astonishingly efficient compared to European settlers struggling through forests in heavy boots and unsuitable clothing. Snowshoes, layered furs, and deep environmental knowledge transformed winter from pure enemy into something survivable. Honestly, the colonists sometimes seem one frozen mitten away from complete collapse. The man by the river points toward the sky while speaking quietly. Another storm likely approaching tomorrow. You cannot tell how he knows. Perhaps cloud shape, perhaps wind, perhaps experience accumulated across generations. Back in the settlements, people still debate weather nervously beside tavern fires, while here someone simply glances upward once and quietly understands what winter intends next. The father offers a small bundle from his coat pocket. Tea leaves. In exchange, the other man hands over dried fish wrapped carefully in cloth. Trade like this occurred constantly across many colonial regions, despite tensions and conflicts elsewhere. Daily survival often encouraged practical cooperation, even when larger politics grew unstable. You crouch near the fire, briefly warming stiff fingers. The smoke smells richer here somehow, mixed with cedar and pine resin. Snow falls lightly again through the trees, though the flakes barely reach the ground beneath dense branches overhead. One detail frequently overlooked in older history books is how much colonists borrowed from indigenous winter practices over time. Clothing adaptations, food preservation methods, snow travel, hunting strategies, and shelter techniques gradually influenced colonial survival across colder regions. Without that knowledge, many settlements would have struggled even more severely during harsh seasons. The father asks quietly about river conditions farther north. The other man responds with a long explanation involving ice thickness, animal movement, and changing currents beneath the surface. Even listening to it feels strangely calming. Every observation sounds careful and earned through direct experience. Nearby, you notice children playing beside another shelter, not loudly. Winter seems to soften everyone's voices. One child slides smoothly across packed snow wearing snowshoes smaller than serving trays. The movement looks effortless compared to the exhausting trudging common in the settlement streets. A small but fascinating custom noted by some early travellers involved indigenous families heating stones and placing them beneath sleeping furs, much like colonial families warmed beds with bricks. Different cultures facing the same cold often discovered surprisingly similar solutions. The father eventually rises, adjusting the axe across his shoulder once more. Daylight is already fading. Winter afternoons vanish quickly beneath thick clouds. Before leaving, the other man points again toward the western sky. Heavy snow tonight. The father nods immediately. No debate, no tavern speculation. just acceptance. You begin walking back toward the settlement carrying bundled fish beneath your coat. Snow thickens gradually around you, while the trees darken into long black shapes against the fading afternoon light. Behind you, the riverside camp disappears almost completely into the forest. Ahead, chimney smoke rises above the colony. The contrast feels striking now. The settlement seems louder somehow after the quiet confidence of the camp near the river. More crowded, more anxious, less certain of the land surrounding it. Some historians continue discussing how differently European settlers and indigenous communities understood winter itself. For many colonists, winter represented hardship to be endured until spring returned. For native groups with generations of local environmental knowledge, winter often remained dangerous yet deeply familiar rather than alien. That difference You feel it while crossing the snowy path homeward. The father walks steadily through the growing wind beside you, while twilight settles across the frozen colony. Ahead, cabin windows begin glowing faintly one by one through the snow. Night is coming again, and already the settlement prepares itself against the cold. By the time you return to the settlement, snow has started falling in earnest again. Large, quiet flakes drift through the fading afternoon light while chimney smoke curls low across the rooftops. The entire colony seems wrapped in grey softness now. Footsteps dull beneath fresh snow, voices carry shorter distances, even the animals sound quieter. The father pauses briefly outside a larger house near the centre of town. Compared to the rough cabin surrounding it, this place appears almost grand. Almost. The windows contain actual glass panes rather than oiled cloth. A second story rises above the lane. Decorative shutters frame the windows despite winter weather already warping the wood slightly at the edges. Still, by modern standards, it would probably qualify as cosy historical inconvenience with severe draft concerns. You step inside after the father delivers the dried fish promised earlier. Warmth greets you immediately. Real warmth. Not perfect, but noticeably stronger than inside the smaller cabin. The room smells of beeswax candles, polished wood, spiced cider, and burning oak. Carpets cover parts of the floor. Curtains hang thick around the windows to block drafts. A clock ticks softly near the fireplace while several chairs upholstered in faded fabric sit arranged beside the hearth. You understand quickly why wealth mattered so much during colonial winters. More blankets, more candles, more food stores, more firewood. Sometimes survival simply looks softer when viewed from money. A number of surviving inventories from wealthy colonial households reveal possessions ordinary settlers rarely owned, including feather mattresses, imported fabrics, silverware, books, clocks, and multiple heated rooms. Yet even affluent homes remained vulnerable to cold by modern expectations. Frost still formed on windows. Water still froze indoors during severe weather. The lady of the house greets the father politely, while servants carry fresh logs toward the fire. You notice how everyone here still wears layers despite the warmer room. Nobody trusts winter enough to relax completely. A young woman sits near the window embroidering cloth beside candlelight. Across from her, an older man reads from a thick book while occasionally warming stiff fingers near the hearth. The fire itself burns brighter than any you have seen yet in the colony. Large oak logs crackle loudly while heat spreads farther across the room. You almost forget the cold outdoors for several dangerous minutes. Then a draft slips beneath the window frame and reminds everyone who remains in charge. The older man complains mildly about ice collecting inside the stable troughs again this morning. Another servant mentions one chimney smoking badly during last week's storm. Even wealthy homes fought constant winter battles. They simply fought with slightly better equipment. An intriguing note from several colonial letters describes upper-class families importing citrus fruits during winter as luxury items. Imagine crossing an ocean in the 18th century just to experience a lemon in February, while half the colony survives on turnips and determination. Honestly, that orange better taste life-changing. The young woman near the window glances outside at the snow. She remarks quietly that the roads will soon become impassable again. The older man nods while turning a page in his book. Travel during winter worried everyone, regardless of status. Wealthy colonists could afford larger homes and better supplies, but storms still isolated towns, froze rivers, and buried roads beneath dangerous drifts. Near the fireplace, you notice something unusual. A warming pan, long-handled and brass-covered, it rests beside the hearth ready for use before bedtime. Servants would fill it with hot coals and slide it beneath blankets to warm beds before sleep, which sounds deeply luxurious until someone forgets the coals are still glowing and accidentally invents indoor panic. The lady of the house offers the father a cup of tea while servants move quietly around the room. Tea itself remains precious enough here to feel ceremonial. Many colonial families could not afford regular imported tea at all, especially after difficult harvests or harsh winters disrupted trade. The contrast with the smaller cabin from earlier lingers in your mind. There, every spoonful of food required careful measuring. Here, dried apples just openly in a bowl beside the fire. Yet even inside this comfortable home, winter leaves visible marks. Wet boots drying near the entrance, extra blankets folded across chairs, condensation freezing lightly around window corners. Everyone still watches the weather constantly. Some historians studying colonial class differences point out that wealth often changed how hardship felt rather than removing hardship entirely. Rich families experienced winter differently, certainly, but they still depended on firewood, weather, healthy livestock, and uncertain supply chains. Outside, wind rattles the shutters briefly. The younger servant crossing the room flinches automatically at the sound. You suspect every person in the colony reacts instinctively to storms by this point in the season. The older man eventually closes his book and begins telling a story about visiting London years earlier. He describes crowded streets, coffee houses glowing late into the night, and shops filled with imported goods from around the world. The younger woman listens dreamily. The father listens politely, and you quietly realize how distant Europe must feel during winters like this one. An ocean away. Another world entirely. A curious comment recorded in one merchant's journal from the early 1700s described colonial winters as making even wealthy families feel far from civilization. That phrase carries weight standing here tonight. The colony may contain comforts and trade goods and elegant homes, but wilderness still surrounds everything beyond the candlelight. The storm outside strengthens gradually. Snow taps against the windows. Servants pull curtains tighter. More logs disappear into the fire. Eventually the father rises to leave before darkness deepens further. The wealthy family urges him to stay longer until the weather eases, but he shakes his head gently. Animals still need tending. Fires still need watching. Winter schedules nobody around comfort. You step back outside into swirling snow where the cold immediately bites through your clothing again. Behind you, warm candlelight glows softly through frosted glass, while ahead the smaller cabins of the settlement huddle beneath gathering darkness. Rich or poor, every household now prepares for another long colonial night. The storm arrives fully after sunset, not dramatically at first. Just thicker snow, stronger wind. Then suddenly the entire settlement disappears behind swirling white darkness. You feel it immediately while hurrying beside the father through the narrow lane toward the cabin. Snow lashes across your face hard enough to sting while wind tears through coats and scarves searching for exposed skin. The lantern swinging near the tavern door barely remains visible 20 steps away. Colonial storms transformed familiar places frighteningly fast. Roads vanished. Fence lines disappeared. Cabins became isolated islands surrounded by blowing snow. The father lowers his head against the wind and pushes forward steadily. Around you, other settlers hurry indoors carrying buckets, tools, firewood, anything left exposed before the weather worsens further. A woman shouts for her son somewhere beyond the snow. A stable door slams violently. Then the storm swallows nearly every sound except wind. You finally reach the cabin and stumble inside trailing snow across the floorboards. Warmth rushes against your frozen hands while the mother immediately bars the door tightly behind you. Inside smells stronger than ever tonight. Smoke. Wet wool. Stew simmering slowly over the fire. Snow melting from boots. The younger girl looks up anxiously from beneath her blankets. Bad one, she asks. The father nods once while brushing ice from his coat. That answer alone seems enough. The older boy immediately checks the shutters near the window while the mother feeds another log into the hearth. Everyone moves with quiet urgency now. Storm nights required preparation because conditions could worsen quickly after dark. You remove frozen gloves near the fire and flex aching fingers back toward warmth. Outside, the wind roars harder against the cabin walls with every passing minute. Some colonial storms lasted days. Entire towns occasionally disappeared beneath drifting snow while travel became impossible. Diaries from New England winters describe doors buried shut overnight and families tunneling pathways between buildings after severe blizzards. Honestly, modern weather apps would simply display the word absolutely not. The cabin creaks sharply as another gust slams against the roof. Snow rattles across the walls. The dog growls softly toward the door before deciding whether itself cannot currently be intimidated and returning to the blankets. The mother begins preparing extra food despite the late hour. Not a feast, just precaution. Storms trapped families indoors unpredictably, and hot meals mattered enormously once temperatures dropped further. You notice water buckets placed closer to the fire so ice cannot form overnight. The father checks the chimney draft twice. Then the musket near the door, then the roofline visible through the narrow edge of the window. Winter storms turned everyone into nervous architects. A small historical curiosity from the period involves people tying ropes between important buildings during severe snowstorms, so they could navigate outdoors without becoming lost in whiteout conditions. Imagine needing a survival rope just to visit your neighbor's barn. The younger child curls closer beside the dog while the older boy pretends not to look worried. His hands keep fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Outside, wind screams suddenly through the trees, hard enough to make the entire cabin shudder. Everyone freezes. Snow spills faintly through one crack near the ceiling. The mother mutters something under her breath that sounds deeply unimpressed with winter as a concept. The father keems onto a stool and stuffs more cloth into the opening, while cold air pours inward. You feel the temperature shift immediately across the room. Even sturdy cabins remained vulnerable during strong storms. Roofs collapsed, chimneys failed, fires died. One weak point in construction could quickly become dangerous after hours of freezing wind. The older boy asks whether the tavern roof will hold. The father thinks a moment before answering. Probably. That word again. Colonial survival involved tremendous emotional dependence on a probably. The fire burns brighter now as everyone crowds closer toward the hearth. Shadows jump wildly across the walls each time the flames shift. The younger girl begins dozing despite the storm while her mother strokes her hair gently. Outside, visibility has vanished completely. You can no longer see neighboring cabins through the window. Only white movement. A physician traveling through the colonies once described winter blizzards as night arriving before evening. That feels exactly right. Storm darkness carries different texture than ordinary night. Heavier, closer somehow. The father eventually tells a story from years earlier, when another storm stranded travelers between settlements for 2 full days. Apparently one man survived by sheltering inside a hollow tree wrapped in horse blankets. The older boy asks whether that really happened. The father shrugs. Man survived, which feels like frontier language for details unimportant. Continue breathing. Some modern researchers studying colonial weather records believe certain winters during the Little Ice Age produced conditions considerably harsher than average 20th century winters in parts of North America. Whether every dramatic story proves fully accurate remains debated, but nobody sitting inside this cabin tonight would volunteer for further experimentation. Another violent gust slams the roof. The younger child wakes immediately. Then comes a loud crack somewhere outside. Everyone stops moving. The father grabs the lantern and opens the door only slightly against the wind. Snow bursts inward, instantly swirling across the floorboards. A tree branch. Nothing more. Still, the father remains outside for several long seconds, checking the roof and stable through blowing snow before returning inside coated white from shoulders to boots. Snow drifting high already, he says quietly. The mother hands him warm cider without speaking. That gesture happens so naturally now it feels ancient. The storm continues hour after hour. Inside, blankets pile thicker around sleeping children, while the adults remain awake longer, beside the fire listening to wind hammer the settlement outside. The cabin creaks, the chimney moans softly, snow brushes endlessly against the walls like waves against a ship. And slowly you understand why colonial families sometimes compared winter storms to being trapped at sea. Beyond the firelight exists only darkness, cold and endless moving white. Everything else narrows to this one room, these few people, this fragile warmth holding back the storm for another night. The storm weakens sometime before dawn, leaving the settlement buried beneath deep, untouched snow. By afternoon, the sky clears into pale silver light, and for the first time in days, people begin emerging carefully from their cabins like cautious woodland creatures checking whether winter still intends violence. It does, just slightly less aggressively today. You help the father clear snow from the path outside the cabin, while smoke rises peacefully from nearby chimneys. Every movement feels slower after the storm. Boots sink deep into drifts, arms ache quickly from shoveling packed snow aside. Yet the settlement seems strangely cheerful. Storm survival creates temporary gratitude. Children laugh again. Neighbours call to one another across snowbanks. Even the tavern door stands open briefly, letting warm air and loud conversation spill into the lane. The younger girl helps scatter grain for chickens near the stable, while the older boy hacks stubborn ice from a water barrel with complete teenage resentment despite technically living before teenagers existed as a recognized species. The mother watches them both from the doorway with folded arms wrapped tightly beneath her shawl. Her cheeks glow red from cold air while loose strands of hair move softly in the wind. You notice the father glancing toward her more often today. Not dramatically. Just small looks. Quiet ones. Colonial courtship and marriage rarely resembled modern romantic fantasies involving violin music and emotionally available men writing poetry beneath balconies. Winter life demanded practicality. A reliable partner mattered far more than charming conversation beside moonlit rivers. Still, affection existed everywhere if you looked carefully enough. A hand lingering briefly against another hand. Extra food placed quietly into someone's bowl. A coat adjusted around cold shoulders. Love often survived here through labour rather than speeches. The mother steps carefully across the packed snow carrying fresh bread wrapped in cloth toward a neighbouring cabin where an elderly widow lives alone. The father watches until she disappears through the drifting snow before returning to his work. That glance tells you everything. Several surviving marriage records and personal letters from colonial America reveal relationships built heavily around cooperation and endurance. Romantic ideals certainly existed, but survival frequently shaped partnership more directly than passion alone. Honestly, it is difficult writing love poetry when someone urgently needs help preventing chickens from freezing. The younger girl eventually pulls you toward a sled path children have carved near the edge of town. Their sled itself appears dangerously homemade, consisting mostly of wood, rope, and confidence. Colonial childhood involved alarming levels of confidence. The older boy insists the hill works perfectly well, despite obvious evidence suggesting otherwise. Moments later, 3 children disappear into a snowbank with enough momentum to qualify as historical aviation. Everyone laughs anyway. Winter amusements often remained simple because they had to be. Snowball fights, sledding, skating or frozen ponds, storytelling beside fires, even difficult seasons left room for joy. A curious account from the early 1700s describes young couples attending winter gatherings where games, music, and dancing continued long after dark despite freezing conditions outdoors. Apparently humans throughout history consistently decide dancing indoors during dangerous weather sounds emotionally necessary. Near sunset, the settlement grows quieter again as people return indoors before temperatures drop. Smoke thickens above the rooftops while golden light fades softly across the snow. The father and mother work together preparing supper tonight. That feels different somehow. The storm passed. The children remain healthy. For one brief evening, the colony breathes easier. Inside the cabin, warmth gathers steadily around the hearth while stew simmers over the fire. The younger girl braids scraps of cloth together near the blankets while the older boy attempts carving another small animal from wood. This one accidentally resembles an emotionally troubled potato. He claims it is a horse. Nobody argues. The father eventually removes a small object wrapped carefully in cloth from a shelf near the hearth. Inside rests a narrow silver ring slightly tarnished with age. The younger girl immediately grins. The older boy groans softly. Apparently this story also appears regularly during winter evenings. The father explains quietly that the ring belonged to the mother's grandmother before crossing the ocean years earlier. During their own courtship, he carried it hidden inside his coat pocket for nearly a month, before finally asking permission to marry her. The mother laughs softly at that. "You are afraid." Cold, he replies immediately. "Convenient explanation. Explanation." You notice how the room changes while they talk, softer somehow. Even the firelight seems warmer against the walls. Scholars examining colonial domestic life often caution against imagining early marriages as emotionless arrangements entirely shaped by economics. Affection, companionship, and tenderness clearly existed within many households, even when daily survival dominated much of life. You can see that tenderness here now, so not dramatic, steady. The mother reaches over at one point and brushes soot from the father's sleeve without interrupting conversation. Such a tiny movement, yet somehow more intimate than half the modern romance industry. Outside, snow begins falling lightly once again. Gentle this time. The younger girl eventually asks whether people still held weddings during winter. The mother nods. Sometimes because families finally had spare time after harvest season ended. Winter gatherings often became important social occasions in isolated settlements where opportunities for courtship remained limited. The older boy immediately asks whether kissing happened at these gatherings. The father nearly chokes on cider. Excellent work, honestly. The mother hides laughter behind one hand while the younger girl looks deeply interested in this shocking new category of information. A small note found in one colonial diary complained bitterly about young couples whispering too long near fires during winter dances, while older relatives attempted maintaining respectable supervision. Human beings remain spectacularly predictable across centuries. Night settles gradually around the cabin while snow drifts softly beyond the windows. Inside, warmth, laughter, and tired companionship fill the room beneath smoke-darkened beams. And for a little while, winter feels less like an enemy and more like something people survive together. Christmas morning arrives beneath soft falling snow. Not the dramatic storm kind, the quiet kind. Large flakes drift slowly through pale grey light while the colony wakes later than usual beneath frozen rooftops and smoking chimneys. The world outside the cabin looks softened somehow, wrapped in silence and white. Inside, the fire survived the night well. That alone feels like a gift. The younger girl wakes first and immediately sits upright beneath the blankets with the intensity of someone expecting miracles. The older boy pretends to remain asleep for another minute before opening one eye toward the hearth. The mother already moves quietly around the room. "You smell something too sweet. Very faint. Apples, perhaps?" The father enters carrying fresh wood dusted with snow while cold morning air slips briefly into the cabin behind him. His beard sparkles white with frost before melting near the warmth. "Merry Christmas," the younger girl whispers sleepily. The father smiles. Not widely, just enough. Colonial Christmas celebrations varied enormously depending on region, religion, and family tradition. In some communities, the holiday remained modest or even controversial, especially among stricter Protestant groups who distrusted excessive celebration. Other families marked the day with food, music, church gatherings, and precious moments of rest during the long winter season. Here inside the cabin, the holiday feels quiet, personal. The mother stirs a small iron pan near the fire while the smell grows richer. Dried apples cooked slowly with a little sugar and spice. Not much sugar. What sugar? Just enough. The younger girl watches with complete awe as though witnessing royal cuisine prepared inside a palace instead of a smoky one-room cabin, trying very hard not to freeze. Honestly, after weeks of root vegetables and salted meat, one warm apple probably does feel spiritually transformative. The older boy receives a tiny carved whistle from his father, roughly made, slightly crooked. Yet the boy handles it with immediate care because handmade gifts carried enormous value in households where spare materials remained scarce. The younger girl unwraps scraps of coloured ribbon saved carefully from previous years. She gasps softly anyway. That moment stays with you. A surviving account from a colonial child described receiving a single orange during winter celebrations and remembering it for decades afterward. Luxury becomes deeply relative once people spend months battling cold, darkness, and limited supplies. Outside, church bells ring slowly across the settlement. Their sound drifts through falling snow while families begin walking carefully toward the meeting house, bundled beneath heavy cloaks and wool scarves. Boots crunch softly across fresh drifts, and you follow beside the family through the snowy lane. Smoke hangs low above the town while lantern light glows faintly through frosted windows. Even the tavern seems quieter today. The meeting house itself remains plain compared to later churches. Wooden benches, bare walls, simple windows letting in cold pale light. People stamp snow from boots near the entrance, while breath clouds softly in the freezing air indoors. Heating large buildings during colonial winters proved difficult and expensive. Many churches remained painfully cold during services. Worshippers sometimes carried heated stones wrapped in cloth or small foot warmers to survive long sermons. The younger girl leans close against her mother beneath shared blankets during the service, while the older boy fights visibly against sleep. The father listens quietly with hands clasped before him. Outside the windows, snow continues drifting downward through bare tree branches. The minister speaks about endurance, about hardship, about gratitude during difficult seasons. His voice rises and falls steadily through the cold room while candles flicker along the walls. You notice how tired many faces look beneath the winter light. Yet they still came, still gathered, still sat shoulder to shoulder through freezing temperatures because communal rituals mattered deeply in isolated settlements. After the service, people linger outside longer than usual despite the cold. Children throw fun snowballs. Neighbours exchange food wrapped carefully in cloth. Someone produces a fiddle near the tavern doorway, and suddenly music spills softly across the snow-covered street. Not grand celebration, just warmth between people. One traveller visiting the colonies wrote with surprise about winter gatherings, where dancing continued inside tiny crowded homes despite icy conditions outdoors. Music, storytelling, and shared meals offered relief from isolation during seasons that otherwise felt endless. The younger girl spins clumsily through the snow holding her ribbons, while the older boy attempts looking unimpressed and fails completely. Back at the cabin, the mother prepares the best meal the family has eaten in weeks: rabbit stew. Fresh bread, the sweet apples saved carefully for today, even a little tea. The fire burns brighter than usual while wind brushes gently along the walls outside. Snowlight reflects faintly through the window covering, making the room glow silver and gold together. The father eventually tells stories from earlier winters while the children listen beside the hearth. One year the river froze so hard people crossed wagons over it. Another year snow buried the stable roof entirely. The younger girl asks whether Christmas ever arrived warm. Everyone laughs softly at that. A small mystery debated among historians involves how closely colonial Christmas traditions resembled later Victorian holiday imagery. Many customs modern people associate with Christmas became popular much later. Early colonial celebrations often looked simpler, quieter, and more tied to local survival than commercial festivity. Still, sitting here tonight beside the fire, the emotional shape feels familiar. Candles glowing softly, warm food shared carefully, children waiting for stories, adults pretending not to be tired for one evening. Outside, snow continues falling peacefully across the sleeping colony. Inside the cabin, the older boy carves at another wooden figure, while the younger girl drifts asleep beside the dog still clutching her ribbons. And for one gentle winter night in 1704, the cold seems to loosen its grip just slightly around the little settlement beneath the snow. The road disappears beneath snow less than a mile beyond the settlement. You realise this almost immediately after leaving town beside the father and a neighbouring farmer at first light. Their wagon creaks slowly across frozen ground while the horse exhales thick clouds of steam into the bitter morning air. The journey itself seems simple enough. Deliver supplies. Oh. Check traps farther east. Return before dark. Yet winter travel in colonial America rarely stayed simple for long. The wagon wheels groan through packed snow, while frost clings thickly to every tree branch around you. Forests stretch endlessly beyond the narrow road. Bare black trunks rise from white drifts like rows of silent pillars, disappearing into grey sky. The cold feels sharper away from the settlement. Lonelier somehow. No chimney smoke here. No nearby voices. Only wind moving softly through frozen woods. The father pulls his coat tighter while the neighbouring farmer mutters something about the weather turning again before nightfall. Apparently every conversation in colonial winter eventually becomes weather discussion because the weather controls literally everything. Road conditions determine trade, travel, communication, survival. A merchant writing in the early 18th century once complained that winter roads became fit only for wolves and fools. Judging from the deep ruts hidden beneath the snow ahead, he may have been optimistic. The horse slows near a frozen stream crossing, where ice groans faintly beneath drifting snow. The men climb down carefully before leading the wagon across by hand. You follow more cautiously. The ice holds. Probably, there is that word again. The father explains quietly that several travellers drowned upriver years earlier, after attempting faster crossings during thaw conditions. Frozen rivers served as roads during some winters, yet they remain dangerous roads with deeply unpleasant consequences for bad decisions. You step quickly once the ice begins making noises resembling distant cannon fire beneath your boots. The forest grows quieter, deeper along the trail. Snow absorbs sound strangely. Even the wagon wheels seem muted now beneath thick drifts. Somewhere far away a crow calls once through the trees. Then nothing. Colonial travel often meant long stretches of silence broken only by practical conversation and environmental sounds. No engines, no radios, just weather, animals, and human thoughts rattling around together for hours. The neighbouring farmer eventually points toward the tracks crossing the road ahead. Deer, fresh. The father studies them briefly before nodding. People living this close to wilderness read signs automatically. Snow became a record book during winter. Animal movement, weather shifts, human travellers, everything left evidence. A curious story appears in one traveller's journal, describing a man who navigated entirely by tree bark patterns during a blizzard after losing the road completely. Whether fully true or improved through dramatic retelling remains uncertain, but survival stories spread quickly through colonial taverns and roadside inns. You continue onward while snow begins falling lightly again through the branches overhead. The road narrows. Then narrows more. At one point you pass an abandoned wagon half buried beside the trees, One wheel remains broken beneath frozen snow. The neighbouring farmer spits into the drift beside it. "Stayed too long after sunset," he mutters. No further explanation needed. Travel after dark frightened many colonists during winter months. Roads vanished easily beneath storms or drifting snow. Inns remained far apart in some regions. A delayed journey could quickly become dangerous once temperatures dropped. The father eventually points toward a cluster of trees ahead where smoke rises faintly between branches. A roadside inn, or at least something trying very hard to qualify as one. You approach slowly while the horse snorts frost into the air. The building leans slightly beneath accumulated snow, though warm light glows through narrow windows near the entrance, or inside smells of wet wool, smoke, onions, and exhausted humanity. Travellers crowd close beside the fire, wrapped in blankets and heavy coats. Boots line the walls, drying near the hearth, while steaming bowls of broth pass from hand to hand across rough tables. The room feels both comforting and deeply suspicious at the same time. Colonial inns varied enormously in quality. Some provided genuine shelter and decent meals. Others offered questionable bedding, loud strangers, and fleas with extensive social experience. A traveller near the fire complains about losing the road entirely yesterday afternoon after sudden snowfall. Another claims his horse sensed the direction better than he did. Honestly believable. The innkeeper serves hot stew thick with beans and salted meat. You eat gratefully while snow taps against the windows outside. A woman seated nearby describes travelling 2 days from another settlement with 3 children and a wagon full of cloth goods. She mentions sleeping one night beside strangers because every bed in the inn was already occupied. Shared sleeping spaces remained common enough during winter travel that many people simply accepted the discomfort. Privacy surrendered quickly once temperatures threatened frostbite. Near the hearth, an older man warns everyone that wolves followed his sleigh for nearly half a mile last winter after sunset. Someone asks what the source c'était. The story grows larger every year. He replies that the wolves themselves probably grew larger too. Fair point, honestly. Outside, daylight already begins fading, though it still feels early. Winter afternoons shorten travel windows dramatically, forcing travellers to plan carefully around distance and weather. The father exchanges a glance with the neighbouring farmer. Time to head back. You step outdoors once more into deepening cold while snow drifts across the road again. The forest darkens quickly beneath heavy clouds. Already the trail behind the inn looks softer, less certain, as though winter quietly erases human movement the moment people pass through it. The wagon creaks homeward through gathering dusk while the settlement waits somewhere beyond the frozen woods. And all around you, colonial winter stretches vast and silent beneath the falling snow. The bell begins ringing just after dawn. Slow, steady. Different from the usual church calls drifting across the settlement. You hear it while standing outside the cabin helping the older boy break ice from the water barrel. The sound carries strangely through the cold morning air, heavy and deliberate enough that everyone nearby pauses what they are doing. The father looks toward the centre of town immediately. Nobody asks questions at first. They already understand. Winter death belonged to colonial life in ways difficult for modern people to fully imagine. Illness, accidents, childbirth complications, exposure, and infections claimed lives regularly across settlements large and small. Cold weather often made everything worse. The father removes his gloves slowly. "Old Mr. Weaver," he says quietly after a moment. The older boy lowers his eyes toward the snow. You remember the elderly man vaguely from earlier visits to town? Thin shoulders, heavy coat, slow careful steps near the tavern door. Now the bell continues sounding through drifting smoke and frozen air. Inside the cabin, the mother hears it too. She closes her eyes briefly before returning to the bread dough resting near the hearth. Life in the colony never truly stops for grief. Fires still require wood, animals still need feeding, water still freezes. That practical rhythm feels almost cruel at first, then strangely compassionate. People survive by continuing. Later that afternoon you walk with the family toward the meeting house through fresh snow. The sky hangs pale and colourless overhead, while boots crunch softly along the packed paths between cabins. The settlement feels quieter today. Even children lower their voices instinctively. Colonial funerals during winter carried additional difficulties beyond grief itself. Frozen ground often made burial painfully hard. In severe weather, some communities delayed burials temporarily or relied on heated tools to break through icy earth. The meeting house smells faintly of wet wool, candle wax, and cold timber. People gather shoulder to shoulder beneath dim light while snow melts slowly from boots near the entrance. Mr. Weaver's family sits near the front. His daughter stares downward with red, tired eyes while a small boy beside her twists his cap nervously between frozen fingers. The minister speaks softly about endurance, memory, and the temporary nature of earthly suffering. His breath clouds faintly in the cold air while candles flicker against bare wooden walls. Outside, wind brushes gently through the trees. Inside, the room remains very still. A surviving colonial letter once described winter funerals as feeling quieter than the snow itself. That phrase lingers in your mind now while everyone listens beneath pale afternoon light. After the service, several men carry the coffin carefully through deep drifts toward the burial ground behind the church. Snow squeaks beneath their boots while the bell rings one final time overhead. The grave itself looks shallow compared to modern burials. The ground resisted them. You can see it in the exhausted faces of the men holding shovels nearby. One scholar studying colonial burial customs noted that winter deaths often reminded settlements how physically fragile their existence remained. Frozen landscapes complicated every ritual people relied upon for comfort and closure. The mother keeps the younger girl close beside Jesus, while the older boy stares silently toward the grave. No one speaks much, or the cold discourages long ceremony. Snow begins falling lightly again before the burial ends. Soft flakes drifting across black coats and bowed heads. The father eventually removes his hat while the minister finishes the final prayer. Around you, people stand motionless despite freezing wind brushing across the hilltop cemetery. Then slowly the gathering breaks apart. Not suddenly, just gradually, neighbours offering food, quiet hands squeezing shoulders, children guided carefully home before darkness arrives. Grief in colonial settlements often became communal because survival already depended so heavily on neighbours. Illness, storms, and hard winters forced people into close practical relationships whether they preferred privacy or not. Back at the cabin, the fire burns brighter than usual tonight. The mother prepares extra stew for Mr. Weaver's daughter and sends the older boy carrying it carefully through the snow after sunset. He returns quieter afterward. The younger girl asks softly whether people feel cold after dying. The room stills immediately. The father stares into the fire before answering. No. The girl seems satisfied with that. Children ask impossible questions with astonishing calm. Outside, snow gathers slowly along the windows while the wind eases into silence. The dog sleeps near the hearth. The older boy sharpens a knife absent-mindedly beside the fire without really looking at it. The mother mends clothing again beneath candlelight. Life resumes. That may be the strangest truth about history. Not battles, not kings, not grand speeches. Just ordinary evenings continuing after loss because people have no alternative. A curious custom from some colonial communities involved stopping clocks inside homes after a death until the funeral concluded. Time itself briefly paused out of respect for the departed. You glance toward the wealthy house across town where a clock once ticked beside the fire. Tonight perhaps it sits silent. The father eventually tells a quiet story about Mr. Weaver helping build the first stable near the river years earlier. The older boy adds another memory about learning trap knots from him during autumn. Even the younger girl remembers receiving a carved wooden bird one winter long ago. Small things remain longest. Outside the cabin, snow covers the burial ground gradually beneath moonlight. Wind smooths the fresh earth while dark trees stand watch beyond the church. The colony settles into another winter night carrying grief the same way it carries cold weather. Not dramatically, just steadily, and beneath the firelight, surrounded by smoke, blankets, and familiar voices, you begin understanding how colonial families endured so much loss without surrendering completely to despair. They remembered, then continued. By late February, something changes in the air. Not warmth exactly, more like a rumour of warmth. You notice it first while standing outside the cabin at dawn, watching pale sunlight spread slowly across the frozen settlement. The snow still lies deep along the roads. Ice still grips the river. Your breath still fogs white before your face. Yet somewhere beneath all that winter, the world seems to hesitate. The father notices it too. Son stays longer now, he says quietly while splitting wood beside the stable. He is right. Evenings no longer vanish quite so quickly. Morning light arrives a little earlier through the windows, tiny differences, almost invisible unless you have spent months watching darkness swallow the colony before supper. People begin speaking about spring carefully, the way exhausted travellers speak about distant shelter. Not confidently, hopefully. The younger girl insists she heard birds yesterday near the trees beyond the river. The older boy claims she actually heard the tavern keeper shouting at chickens again. Both explanations seem equally possible honestly. Inside the cabin, winter routines continue unchanged for now. Fires still require constant tending. Boots still dry beside the hearth. Blankets still pile thickly near sleeping children every night. But signs appear anyway. Snow melting slightly near southern walls during midday sun. Icicles dripping faintly before freezing again overnight. The smell of damp earth occasionally rising beneath the snow. One colonial minister wrote that late winter often felt emotionally harder than early winter, because people grew impatient for change while cold weather stubbornly continued. You understand that feeling deeply now. Everyone in the settlement carries subtle tiredness beneath daily tasks. The mother studies remaining food stores more often. The father checks trapping lines farther from the town hoping for fresh meat. The older boy watches the road whenever travellers arrive. Hungry for news from elsewhere, winter has lasted long enough. Still life persists. The tavern grows busier again as roads improve slightly between storms. Travellers arrive carrying muddy boots instead of frozen ones. Someone claims southern towns already smell like thawing fields after rain. The younger girl listens with complete wonder as though hearing descriptions of paradise. A small observation from several colonial diaries mentions how intensely people anticipated spring after difficult winters. Tiny seasonal shifts mattered enormously in a world tied directly to weather and harvest cycles. The first visible robin could become genuine local news. Today, while hauling water from the river, you notice dark moving water showing through widening cracks near the shore ice. The sound surprises you most. Dripping, flowing. Tiny streams whispering beneath frozen surfaces. After months of silence and snow muffling everything, water suddenly sounds alive. The father warns the older boy repeatedly to avoid crossing the river ice now. Late winter crossings became notoriously dangerous because thawing weakened surfaces unevenly. The older boy promises obedience with the deeply unconvincing expression common to young humans throughout history. Back at the cabin, the mother opens the door longer during daylight while smoke escapes more freely into the cold air outside. The room smells fresher afterwards somehow, less trapped. Even the dog seems more energetic lately, though that may simply reflect optimism regarding mud season and future opportunities involving reckless running. Near sunset, the settlement gathers briefly near the meeting house after another wagon arrives from the south. Travellers unload sacks of flour, barrels of salt, letters, and rumours in nearly equal quantities. One woman insists orchards farther downriver already show buds. Nobody entirely believes her, yet nobody dismisses it either. A researcher examining colonial seasonal records once noted how emotionally tied communities became to natural rhythms because survival depended so directly on them. Modern people check calendars, colonists checked skies, soil, birds, river ice, and tree branches. Nature itself became the clock. The father eventually walks with you beyond the edge of town where snow lies thinner beneath pine trees. The forest smells different now. Still cold, still sharp, but softer underneath. You hear distant dripping water echoing through the woods. The father pauses beside a maple tree scarred from earlier tapping seasons. Soon, he explains, families will gather sap again once temperatures shift properly between freezing nights and warmer days. You imagine the colony months from now. Mud replacing snow, windows opened wider. Children running without 3 layers of wool wrapped around them like tiny angry onions. It feels almost impossible, yet everyone here trusts spring eventually arrives because they have survived enough winters to know. Even grief changes slightly now. Mister. Weaver's grave behind the meeting house lies buried beneath snow, yet small animal tracks cross nearby this morning. Life already moves around lost quietly, deadly, without asking permission. The younger girl eventually finds one tiny green shoot near the southern wall of the cabin. Probably too early, probably doomed. She protects it anyway, using small stones arranged carefully around the spot. No one tells her not to bother. That feels important. Inside the cabin tonight, the fire burns lower than usual because temperatures have eased slightly outside. The mother notices immediately and smiles faintly without mentioning it. The older boy sharpens fishing hooks near the hearth. The father repairs harness straps for spring travel. Everyone prepares unconsciously for movement after months of endurance. Outside, snow melts slowly from the roof edge, drop by drop beneath pale moonlight. Somewhere beyond the trees, water moves beneath breaking river ice, carrying winter gradually away from the colony. And for the first time since arriving here, you realize the settlement does not merely survive winter, it waits through it. Together. Tonight the settlement feels quieter than usual. Not empty, not sad, just tired in the deep settled way that follows a long winter finally beginning to loosen its grip. You sit beside the hearth while evening shadows stretch softly across the cabin walls. Outside, snow still covers the ground in pale silver layers beneath moonlight, but patches of dark earth now appear near the stable and along the southern edges of buildings. The world is changing slowly. The fire crackles gently before you, not the desperate roaring fire from storm nights earlier in the season. This one burns calm and steady while warmth drifts easily through the room. The younger girl sleeps already beside the dog with one hand tucked beneath her cheek. The older boy leans against the wall, carving absent-mindedly at another impossible wooden horse. At least you think it is a horse this time. Improvement. The mother folds repaired clothing near the hearth while the father oils leather harness straps for spring travel. Every motion feels slower tonight, more relaxed. Outside, dripping water taps softly from the roof edge. A sound nearly forgotten after months of ice. The cabin smells familiar now in a comforting way. Smoke in the beams, wool blankets warmed by firelight, bread cooling near the hearth. Damp earth carried indoors on boots for the first time in weeks. You realize how completely winter-shaped life here in 1704. The darkness, the labour, the fear of storms, the endless watching of firewood, weather, and food stores. Even ordinary nights required planning, patience, and resilience that most modern people rarely need to consider. And yet within all that hardship existed warmth too. Not just physical warmth, human warmth. Families sharing stories beside dim fires, neighbours carrying food through storms, children laughing in snowdrifts, quiet hands reaching across blankets during the coldest hours before dawn. One traveller passing through the colonies described winter settlements as looking fragile from outside but feeling unexpectedly alive once you stepped indoors. That observation feels exactly right tonight. The father finally sets aside the leather straps and leans back with tired eyes toward the fire. Orange light flickers softly across his face while wind brushes gently against the cabin walls. Nothing violent now, just wind. The younger girl stirs briefly in sleep and murmurs something about ribbons from Christmas. The mother smiles faintly before pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. Small memories survive longest. Across the room, The older boy finishes carving at last and places the little wooden horse beside the sleeping child without saying a word. The gesture feels strangely full circle somehow. Winter began with fear and uncertainty. Now it ends with familiar routines and softened edges. Outside the cabin, the colony settles gradually into sleep beneath stars and melting snow. Chimney smoke rises lazily into cold night air while distant dogs bark once or twice near the tavern road. Farther away, the river moves beneath thinning ice. You can hear it now if you listen carefully. Water flowing under winter, always there beneath the silence. A historian once remarked that colonial survival depended less on strength than on repetition. Daily tasks repeated steadily through darkness, illness, storms, and grief until spring finally returned. Watching this family tonight, that idea feels deeply true. Nobody here conquered winter dramatically. They endured it together one ordinary evening at a time. The fire burns lower. The mother yawns softly while folding the final blanket. The father rises to secure the door against the night air before checking the embers one last time. Those movements have become ritual now. Automatic, ancient feeling. Even the dog barely opens one eye anymore. Outside, moonlight reflects across wet snowbanks while icicles drip steadily from the roof edge. Somewhere beyond the settlement, geese may already be travelling north through darkness unseen by anyone sleeping below. Spring approaches quietly, not all at once, just enough. And sitting here beside the fading hearth, you begin to understand something important about these winter nights in colonial America. People remembered them not because life was picturesque. Most of the time it was not. The cabin smoked. The roads vanished. The cold crept through walls and blankets and boots. Children became sick. Storms trapped families indoors for days. Loneliness lingered heavily at the edges of candlelight. But still people built lives here. They fell in love, raised children, shared meals, told stories, mourned losses, waited for birdsong to return beyond the frozen trees. And perhaps that is why these long winter evenings still feel strangely close across the centuries. Because beneath all the unfamiliar hardships, the heart of the experience remains recognizable. A fire glowing softly in darkness. Loved ones nearby. Relief when morning finally comes. The room grows quieter now. Only the soft crackle of settling embers remains. The mother closes her eyes beside the hearth while the father stares thoughtfully into the final flames. Outside, snowmelt drips slowly into the frozen earth beneath a pale colonial moon. The season is ending. The colony breathes easier. And somewhere far beyond the sleeping settlement, spring waits patiently beyond the trees. The fire dims lower still. Orange becoming red, red becoming faint silver ash. The cabin settles gently around you while breathing slows and the night softens. So now, as the last warmth drifts quietly through the room and the long colonial winter finally begins loosening its hold, you can rest too, safe beside the fading hearth, listening to distant water beneath the ice, while the old colony sleeps. Sweet dreams.